Thank you all for your continued support. If you found this content valuable, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement truly helps us. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Long before the first European explorers set foot on American soil, this vast continent was home to hundreds of distinct indigenous nations, each with their own sophisticated spiritual traditions. These were not primitive beliefs, as European colonizers would later claim, but complex theological systems that had evolved over millennia, deeply intertwined with the land, the seasons, and the intricate relationships between all living things. The diversity of Native American spiritual traditions was extraordinary, from the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest to the Iroquois of the Northeast, from the Plains tribes to the Pacific Northwest nations. Each group had developed unique ways of understanding the sacred. Yet beneath this diversity lay common threads that would profoundly influence the spiritual landscape of America, even as they faced systematic suppression. Central to most indigenous spiritual traditions was the concept of animism, the belief that all things possess a spiritual essence. This wasn't merely a philosophical position, but a lived reality that shaped every aspect of daily life. The Lakota spoke of Wakun Tanka, often translated as Great Spirit, but more accurately understood as the sacred power that flows through all existence. For the Cherokee, this divine presence was known as the Great Creator, while the Navajo understood it as the holy people who had established the natural order. These beliefs were not abstract concepts discussed in temples or churches. They were integrated into hunting practices, agricultural cycles, governance structures, and personal relationships. When a Lakota hunter took the life of a buffalo, it was within a framework of spiritual reciprocity and gratitude. The animal's sacrifice was understood as a gift that required proper ceremonies and respectful use of every part of the carcass. This wasn't mere pragmatism, but a theological understanding of the interconnectedness of all life. The seasonal ceremonies that marked the indigenous calendar were profound spiritual events that maintained the balance between the human and natural worlds. The Hopi snake dance, the Cherokee green corn ceremony, and the Ojibwe Mediwin rituals were complex liturgical events that could last for days, involving elaborate preparations, specific songs and dances, and the participation of entire communities. These weren't entertainment, but essential spiritual work that maintained cosmic harmony. Indigenous spiritual leadership took many forms, but common across most traditions was the role of the medicine person or shaman, individuals who had undergone extensive training and initiation to serve as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. These spiritual leaders were responsible for healing, divination, ceremony, and maintaining the oral traditions that preserved each nation's sacred knowledge. Their authority came not from institutional appointment, but from demonstrated spiritual power and community recognition. The oral tradition was crucial to indigenous spirituality. Sacred stories passed down through generations contained not just entertainment, but theological instruction, moral guidance, and practical wisdom. These narratives explained the origins of the world, the relationships between different forms of life, and humanity's proper place within creation. The Iroquois creation story of Sky Woman falling through a hole in the celestial realm onto the back of a great turtle, forming the earth, provided both cosmological understanding and moral instruction about cooperation and respect for the natural world. Dreams and visions held special significance in indigenous spiritual life. Among the Plains tribes, the Vision Quest, a solitary journey into the wilderness seeking spiritual revelation, was a crucial rite of passage. Young people would fast and pray alone in sacred places, seeking visions that would guide their adult lives. These experiences were understood as direct communication with the spirit world, providing personal spiritual authority and community responsibility. The concept of sacred space was fundamental to indigenous beliefs, but it differed significantly from European understanding. Rather than being confined to specific buildings, the sacred was encountered in particular landscapes, mountains, rivers, caves, and forests that held special spiritual significance. The Black Hills were sacred to the Lakota, while Mount Shasta held spiritual importance for numerous California tribes. These weren't merely places to visit for worship. but were understood as living entities with their own spiritual presence. Healing practices combined spiritual and physical elements in ways that European medicine was only beginning to understand. Indigenous healers worked with plants, minerals, and spiritual forces to address illness, understanding that physical ailments often had spiritual causes. The sweat lodge ceremony, practiced by many plains and woodland tribes, was both a physical purification and a spiritual renewal, connecting participants with ancestral wisdom and divine guidance. The role of women in indigenous spiritual traditions was often more prominent than in European religious systems. Many tribes recognized female spiritual leaders, and women's ceremonies, particularly those related to life transitions and fertility, were central to community spiritual life. The Iroquois clan mothers held significant political and spiritual authority, while among the Cherokee, women's councils had important roles in decision-making and ceremonial life. Indigenous concepts of time and eternity differed fundamentally from European Christian understanding. Rather than linear progression toward a final judgment, many indigenous traditions embraced cyclical time, where past, present, and future were interconnected. The Hopi prophecies spoke of recurring cycles of destruction and renewal, while the Mayan calendar reflected sophisticated understanding of multiple overlapping time cycles. Death was often understood not as an ending, but as a transition to another form of existence, with the deceased continuing to influence the living community. The arrival of European colonizers brought catastrophic disruption to these spiritual traditions. Diseases decimated indigenous populations, destroying the elder generation that carried sacred knowledge. Military conquests scattered communities and disrupted ceremonial cycles. Most devastating was the systematic effort to suppress indigenous religions, often through violent means. Spanish missionaries in the Southwest, French Jesuits in the Great Lakes region, and Protestant missionaries throughout the colonies all worked to replace indigenous beliefs with Christianity. The colonial period saw the establishment of mission systems that forcibly removed indigenous children from their families, forbade the speaking of native languages, and punished the practice of traditional ceremonies. The California missions, established by Franciscan friars, essentially enslaved thousands of indigenous people, forcing them to abandon their spiritual practices and adopt Christianity. Similar patterns occurred throughout the continent, from the Puritan, praying towns of New England to the boarding schools that would later epitomize cultural genocide. Yet indigenous spiritual traditions proved remarkably resilient. Even as surface practices were suppressed, core beliefs often persisted, sometimes hidden within Christian symbolism. The Pueblo people of the Southwest maintained their ceremonial calendar while appearing to accept Catholic practices. Native American communities developed syncretic religious forms that combined Christian elements with traditional beliefs, creating new spiritual expressions that honored both traditions. The impact of indigenous spirituality on American religious development was profound, though often unacknowledged. European colonists, despite their official rejection of pagan beliefs, were influenced by indigenous understanding of the sacredness of the American landscape. The transcendentalist movement of the 19th century, with its emphasis on nature mysticism and individual spiritual experience, showed clear influence from indigenous thought. Even contemporary American spirituality, with its emphasis on personal revelation and connection to nature, reflects indigenous influences. The persistence of indigenous spiritual traditions into the present day represents one of the most remarkable stories of religious survival in human history. Despite centuries of suppression, forced conversion, and cultural genocide, indigenous communities have maintained their spiritual connections to the land and their ancestral traditions. The Native American Religious Freedom Act of 1978 finally provided legal protection for indigenous religious practices, acknowledging rights that should never have been denied. Today, indigenous spiritual traditions continue to evolve and adapt while maintaining their essential character. Native American communities practice their traditional ceremonies alongside various forms of Christianity, creating complex religious identities that honor both their ancestral heritage and their contemporary experience. The influence of indigenous spirituality extends far beyond Native American communities, as millions of Americans seek spiritual practices that emphasize connection to nature, community responsibility, and holistic understanding of human existence. The story of indigenous spirituality in America is not a tale of the past, but a living tradition that continues to shape American religious life. As we explore the arrival of European religious traditions, we must remember that they encountered not an empty spiritual landscape, but a continent rich with sophisticated theological traditions that had nurtured human communities for thousands of years. The interaction between these traditions, sometimes violent, sometimes syncretic, always complex, would fundamentally shape the unique character of American religious experience. The small ship that approached the coast of Cape Cod in November 1620 carried more than passengers. It carried a religious revolution. The Mayflower, blown off course from its intended destination in Virginia, would land its human cargo in a place where they would have the freedom to create something unprecedented, a society built entirely on their understanding of biblical principles. The 102 souls aboard that vessel, roughly half of whom were religious separatists fleeing persecution in England, would establish the foundation for what would become one of the most religiously diverse and influential nations in human history. But the story of the Pilgrims begins not in the New World, but in the religious upheaval of early modern England. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the unity of medieval Christendom, and by the early 17th century, English Protestantism itself was fragmenting into competing visions of proper Christian practice. The Church of England, established by Henry VIII and solidified under Elizabeth I, represented a middle way between Catholicism and more radical Protestant reforms. For many English Christians, however, this middle way was a compromise that had not gone far enough in purifying the Church of Catholic influences. The Puritans, as they came to be known, believed that the English Reformation was incomplete. They saw in the Church of England too many remnants of Catholic practice, episcopal hierarchy, elaborate liturgy, ornate churches, and what they perceived as an insufficiently reformed theology. Drawing inspiration from continental Reformed theologians like John Calvin, English Puritans advocated for a more thoroughly biblical Christianity that would strip away centuries of Catholic tradition and return to what they believed were New Testament church practices. Among the Puritans, a smaller group took an even more radical position. These separatists, as they were called, concluded that the Church of England was so corrupted that it could not be reformed from within. They believed that true Christians must separate entirely from the established church and form new congregations based purely on biblical principles. This position was not merely theological, but profoundly political, as it challenged the entire structure of English society, where church and state were intimately connected. The separatist congregation that would eventually sail on the Mayflower had formed in the village of Scrooby in Nottinghamshire, under the leadership of William Brewster, an educated gentleman who had served in government before embracing radical Protestant theology. The group met secretly in Brewster's manor house, as their activities were illegal under English law. In 1608, facing increasing persecution, the entire congregation fled to the Netherlands, where they spent 12 years in exile in the city of Leiden. The Netherlands provided religious tolerance that England denied, but the separatists faced new challenges in their Dutch refuge. Their children were assimilating into Dutch culture, learning Dutch rather than English, and some were abandoning the strict religious practices of their parents. Economic opportunities were limited for English refugees, and many struggled to make adequate livings. Most troubling of all, the 12 years' truce between the Netherlands and Spain was ending, threatening to plunge the region back into the religious warfare that had devastated Europe for decades. It was in this context that the Leiden separatists began contemplating an even more radical solution: emigration to the New World. America represented the possibility of creating a society organized entirely according to their religious principles, free from the corrupting influences of established churches and ungodly governments. They could raise their children in a purely Christian environment while maintaining their English identity and securing their economic future. The decision to emigrate was not taken lightly. The separatists understood that they were proposing to transport their entire community across an ocean to an unsettled wilderness where they would face unknown dangers and hardships. They spent months in prayer and consultation, seeking divine guidance for this momentous decision. William Bradford, who would later serve as governor of Plymouth Colony for 30 years, wrote that they believed God was calling them to this mission, despite the obvious risks. Securing passage to America required complex negotiations with English merchants who were willing to finance the voyage in exchange for the colonists' labor. The Virginia Company had been granted rights to establish settlements in the New World, and the separatists obtained permission to settle within the company's territory. They would establish a joint stock company with their English investors, working for 7 years to pay off their transportation costs and initial supplies. Not all of the Leiden congregation chose to make the journey. Many were too old or too poor to undertake such a venture. Others doubted the wisdom of abandoning the relative security of the Netherlands for the uncertainties of the American wilderness. In the end, only about 35 members of the Leiden congregation joined the expedition. They were joined by other English emigrants, some of whom shared their religious convictions, while others were motivated primarily by economic opportunity. The Mayflower departed from England in September 1620, carrying 102 passengers and crew members. The voyage was difficult, taking over 2 months in cramped, unsanitary conditions. 1 passenger died during the crossing, and another was born. More seriously, the ship was blown off course by storms and arrived at Cape Cod rather than the mouth of the Hudson River, where they had intended to settle. This meant they were outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company and had no legal authority to establish a government. It was in response to this crisis that the passengers drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact, one of the most important documents in American political and religious history. The compact was a brief agreement in which the signers covenanted together to form a civil body politic and to enact just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. While the language was political, the theological assumptions were clear. The colonists understood themselves as entering into a covenant with God to establish a Christian society. The concept of covenant was central to Puritan theology and political thought. Drawing from Reformed theology, Puritans believed that God had entered into covenants with humanity throughout history, beginning with Adam and continuing through Abraham, Moses, and ultimately Christ. These divine covenants established the terms of the relationship between God and humanity, specifying both divine promises and human obligations. The Mayflower Compact represented the colonists' understanding that they were entering into a similar covenant with God to establish a godly society in the New World. The landing at Plymouth Rock, though the famous rock itself was identified only decades later, marked the beginning of one of the most significant experiments in religious society in human history. The Plymouth colonists understood themselves as modern Israelites, led by God to a promised land where they could worship according to their consciences and establish a society based on biblical principles. They saw their emigration not as an escape from difficulty, but as a divine mission to create a model Christian community that would serve as an example to the world. The first winter was catastrophic. Disease, exposure, and malnutrition killed half the colonists before spring. Bradford wrote that there were times when only 6 or 7 people were healthy enough to care for the sick and dying. Yet the survivors interpreted their suffering through theological lenses, understanding it as divine testing that would ultimately strengthen their faith and their community. They held fast to their belief that God had called them to this place for a purpose. The survival of Plymouth Colony depended not only on divine providence, as the colonists understood it, but also on assistance from local indigenous peoples. Squanto, a Patuxet Indian who had been enslaved and taken to Europe before escaping back to America, served as interpreter and guide, teaching the colonists how to cultivate corn and navigate relationships with local tribes. The colonists interpreted this assistance as further evidence of divine favor, though they remained largely blind to the theological significance of indigenous spirituality. The political structure that emerged at Plymouth reflected Puritan theological principles. The colony was governed by elected officials who were expected to rule according to biblical law. Church membership was required for full political participation, though the definition of church membership was carefully controlled. Only those who could demonstrate a genuine conversion experience and commitment to Puritan principles were admitted to full communion, creating a religious elite that controlled both spiritual and temporal affairs. The Plymouth model would prove influential far beyond the small colony itself. The idea that a society could be organized according to religious principles, with civil government serving to support and protect the true church, would shape American political thought for generations. The concept of covenant would evolve into ideas about social contract and democratic government, while the emphasis on individual conversion experience would contribute to American religious individualism. But Plymouth was not the only Puritan experiment in the New World. Within a decade, the much larger Massachusetts Bay Colony was established by Puritans who remained technically within the Church of England, but shared many of the same theological convictions as the Plymouth separatists. Led by John Winthrop, the Massachusetts Bay colonists explicitly understood their mission as creating a city upon a hill that would serve as a model to the world of what a truly Christian society could achieve. The sermon that Winthrop delivered aboard the ship Arbella in 1630 articulated the theological vision that would guide Massachusetts Bay Colony and influence American religious thought for centuries. "We shall be as a city upon a hill," Winthrop declared. "The eyes of all people are upon us." This was not merely political rhetoric, but a profound theological statement about America's role in divine history. The colonists understood themselves as participants in God's plan for the redemption of the world, with their success or failure having cosmic significance. The Massachusetts Bay Colony implemented this vision through a comprehensive legal and social system based on Puritan interpretation of biblical law. The colony's legal code, known as the Body of Liberties, drew heavily from Old Testament law while adapting it to New World conditions. Capital punishment was prescribed for crimes including adultery, blasphemy, and witchcraft, reflecting the colonists' belief that civil government had a responsibility to enforce divine law. Education was a crucial component of the Puritan vision for society. The colonists believed that all people needed to be able to read the Bible for themselves, and they established the first public schools in America to ensure universal literacy. Harvard College was founded in 1636 specifically to train ministers who could maintain the theological purity of the colony. The Puritans' emphasis on education would have lasting effects on American culture, establishing a tradition of public education and higher learning that would distinguish American society from much of the world. The Puritan understanding of calling, the belief that God had assigned each person a specific role in society, shaped colonial economic and social life. Unlike Catholic traditions that elevated celibate monasticism, Puritans believed that all honest work was a form of religious service. Merchants, farmers, and craftsmen were serving God through their labor just as much as ministers were serving through their preaching. This Protestant work ethic would become a defining characteristic of American culture. Yet the Puritan experiment also contained the seeds of its own transformation. The emphasis on individual conversion experience and personal relationship with God created space for religious individualism that would eventually challenge clerical authority. The requirement that each person be able to read and interpret Scripture for themselves inevitably led to theological diversity and disagreement. The very success of Puritan colonies in creating prosperous, stable societies reduced the religious intensity that had motivated the original emigrants. By the end of the 17th century, Puritan ministers were lamenting the decline of religious fervor among their congregations. The children and grandchildren of the original settlers seemed more concerned with worldly success than spiritual purity. The Halfway Covenant of 1662, which allowed partial church membership for those who could not demonstrate full conversion experience, represented a compromise with this reality, but also a significant departure from original Puritan principles. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 marked both the climax and the beginning of the end of Puritan theocracy in New England. The trials reflected the intense religious worldview of Puritan society, where the supernatural was understood as constantly present, and the battle between good and evil was fought in everyday life. But the excesses of the trials, which led to the execution of 20 people on charges of witchcraft, also discredited the authority of religious leaders and raised questions about the wisdom of combining religious and civil authority. The legacy of the Puritan experiment in America was complex and enduring. The political theology that emerged from Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay would influence American political thought from the Revolution through the Civil War and beyond. The idea that America had a special role in divine history, that it was chosen by God for a particular mission in the world, would become a persistent theme in American culture. The emphasis on individual religious experience, universal education, and the dignity of ordinary work would help shape distinctively American values. At the same time, the Puritan legacy included elements that would prove troubling in American religious development. The identification of a particular religious tradition with divine will, the exclusion of religious minorities from full participation in society, and the use of government power to enforce religious conformity would create ongoing tensions in American religious life. The challenge of maintaining religious commitment while respecting religious diversity would become a defining characteristic of American religious experience. The story of the Pilgrims and their mission represents the beginning of one of the most important chapters in the history of world religion. Their conviction that it was possible to create a society organized according to divine principles, their willingness to risk everything for the sake of religious freedom, and their success in establishing viable communities in the New World would inspire countless other religious groups to seek refuge and opportunity in America. The religious freedom they claimed for themselves would eventually, though not without struggle, be extended to others, creating the foundation for the religious diversity that would become America's greatest contribution to world civilization. While the Puritans of New England were establishing their vision of a godly society, other religious groups were simultaneously planting very different seeds of faith throughout colonial America. The story of American religious diversity begins not with the gradual acceptance of different denominations, but with the radical experiment of allowing competing religious visions to coexist from the very beginning of European settlement. This early pluralism was born not from tolerance in the modern sense, but from practical necessity, theological conviction, and the sheer impossibility of maintaining religious uniformity across the vast American landscape. The Society of Friends, known as Quakers, represented perhaps the most radical departure from conventional Christianity in the 17th century. Founded by George Fox in England during the 1640s, Quakerism emerged from the religious turmoil of the English Civil War with a revolutionary understanding of Christian faith and practice. Fox and his followers believed that the same divine light that had illuminated Christ was present in every human being, making formal religious institutions and clerical hierarchies unnecessary obstacles to direct communion with God. This doctrine of the inner light was profoundly subversive to both religious and political authority. If every person could receive direct revelation from God, what need was there for priests, ministers, or bishops? If the divine spirit could speak through anyone, regardless of social status, education, or gender, what justification existed for social hierarchies based on birth or wealth? The Quakers' refusal to take oaths, their rejection of military service, and their practice of allowing women to preach made them dangerous radicals in the eyes of established authorities. The first Quakers arrived in colonial America in the 1650s, and they faced immediate persecution. In Puritan New England, they were viewed as heretics whose beliefs threatened the foundations of Christian society. Massachusetts Bay Colony passed laws specifically targeting Quakers, imposing fines, imprisonment, and eventually banishment for anyone found practicing or promoting Quaker beliefs. When banished Quakers returned to the colony, they faced even harsher penalties, including public whipping and, in several cases, execution. The martyrdom of 4 Quakers on Boston Common between 1659 and 1661 marked a turning point in American religious history. The executions shocked many colonists and generated sympathy for the persecuted sect. More importantly, they demonstrated the lengths to which religious authorities would go to maintain orthodoxy, raising questions about the wisdom and morality of using civil power to enforce religious conformity. The Quaker martyrs became symbols of religious conscience standing against oppressive authority, a theme that would resonate throughout American religious development. Despite persecution, Quakerism spread rapidly throughout the American colonies. The movement's emphasis on individual spiritual experience and its rejection of formal religious requirements appealed to many colonists who felt alienated from established churches. Quaker meetings, conducted in simple meeting houses without altars, stained glass, or religious imagery, offered a stark contrast to both Anglican and Puritan worship. The practice of silent worship, broken only when the Spirit moved someone to speak, created space for genuine spiritual experience that many found lacking in more formal religious services. The transformation of Quakerism from a persecuted sect to a powerful political force came through William Penn's establishment of Pennsylvania in 1681. Penn, son of a prominent English admiral, had converted to Quakerism while a student at Oxford, causing a permanent rift with his family and costing him his inheritance. When Charles II granted Penn territory in America to settle a debt owed to his father, Penn saw an opportunity to create a society based on Quaker principles of peace, equality, and religious tolerance. Pennsylvania's frame of government and Charter of Privileges established the most liberal religious policies in the Western world. Penn guaranteed freedom of worship to all Christians and extended political rights to all who believed in God, regardless of their specific religious beliefs. This was not merely tolerance, the grudging acceptance of religious minorities, but positive recognition of religious diversity as beneficial to society. Penn believed that religious freedom would attract the best and most industrious settlers, creating a prosperous and peaceful society. The Quaker approach to religious pluralism was rooted in their theology of the inner light. If God could speak through anyone, then truth might be found in unexpected places and through unlikely messengers. This theological foundation enabled Pennsylvania Quakers to maintain better relations with indigenous peoples than most other colonial settlements. Penn insisted on purchasing land from Native Americans rather than simply claiming it by conquest, and he made genuine efforts to understand and respect indigenous spiritual traditions. The success of Pennsylvania's experiment in religious tolerance attracted religious minorities from throughout Europe and the American colonies. German Pietists, Mennonites, Moravians, and other sectarian groups established communities throughout the colony. Each group maintained its own religious practices while participating in the colony's economic and political life. This early religious diversity created a model for American pluralism that would eventually influence the entire nation. Yet even Pennsylvania's tolerance had limits. The colony's religious freedom extended only to Christians, and Catholics faced particular suspicion due to their perceived loyalty to foreign powers. Jews were not explicitly welcomed, though some found refuge in the colony. The assumption that society required some form of Christian foundation remained largely unquestioned, even among the most tolerant colonial leaders. Catholics represented a different kind of challenge to Protestant America. Unlike the various Protestant sects, Catholicism was not simply a different interpretation of Christianity, but a completely different understanding of religious authority and spiritual life. The Catholic emphasis on sacramental religion, clerical celibacy, papal authority, and devotion to Mary and the saints seemed foreign and threatening to most Protestant colonists. The association of Catholicism with Spanish and French imperial ambitions made Catholic colonists suspect as potential traitors to English interests. Maryland's founding as a Catholic refuge represented a unique experiment in American colonial history. George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, had converted to Catholicism and faced exclusion from public life in England as a result. When he received a charter to establish a colony in America, he saw an opportunity to create a haven for his fellow Catholics. The Maryland colony was designed to be profitable for its proprietors while providing religious freedom for Catholic settlers. The Maryland Act of Toleration, passed in 1649, was the first law in American history to guarantee religious freedom by legislative action. The act protected all Christians who believed in the Trinity, effectively excluding Jews and other non-Christians, but providing unprecedented protection for Catholic practice in a largely Protestant society. The law was remarkable for its time, establishing the principle that civil government should not interfere with religious conscience. However, Maryland's Catholic experiment faced constant challenges. Catholics were never more than a minority in the colony, as economic opportunities attracted Protestant settlers in much larger numbers. Political control shifted back and forth between Catholic and Protestant factions, with each group attempting to restrict the other's religious and political rights when in power. The English Revolution of 1688, which brought Protestant monarchs to the throne, led to the establishment of the Church of England as Maryland's official church, and the imposition of legal disabilities on Catholics. The experience of Catholics in colonial America illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of religious tolerance in the 18th century. While Catholics could practice their faith in some colonies, they faced legal restrictions on their political participation and professional opportunities. Anti-Catholic prejudice remained strong throughout the colonial period, fed by fears of French and Spanish Catholic powers and suspicions about Catholic loyalty to foreign authorities. The diversity of Protestant denominations in colonial America created additional pressures for religious accommodation. Anglicans, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, and Reformed churches all competed for members and influence. Each group believed that its particular interpretation of Christianity was most faithful to biblical truth. Yet the practical necessity of coexistence forced them to develop new approaches to religious difference. The Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, became the most religiously diverse region in colonial America. Dutch Reformed churches, established during the period of Dutch colonial rule, continued to serve Dutch settlers after English conquest. German Lutheran and Reformed congregations ministered to German immigrants. English Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Baptists established competing churches. The result was a religious marketplace unlike anything seen before in Christian history. This religious diversity created new challenges for colonial governments. How could civil authorities maintain order and legitimacy when their subjects held fundamentally different beliefs about religious truth and spiritual authority? The traditional European solution, establishing one church and suppressing all others, was impossible in colonies where religious minorities were too numerous and too influential to suppress. Colonial leaders had to develop new approaches to managing religious diversity. The emergence of denominationalism represented one solution to the challenge of religious pluralism. Rather than viewing religious differences as threats to social order, denominationalism treated them as acceptable variations within a broader Christian consensus. Each denomination was understood as offering a particular path to Christian truth, with different groups appealing to different temperaments and theological preferences. This approach allowed for religious competition, while maintaining the assumption that society required some form of Christian foundation. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s both challenged and reinforced colonial religious diversity. The revival movement cut across denominational lines, creating new religious experiences that transcended traditional church boundaries. Itinerant preachers like George Whitefield drew massive crowds from all denominations, preaching a message of personal conversion and spiritual renewal that resonated with colonists, regardless of their particular church affiliation. At the same time, the Great Awakening created new religious divisions within existing denominations. New Light Christians, who emphasized personal conversion experience and emotional religious expression, often found themselves at odds with Old Light believers who preferred more traditional and rational approaches to faith. These divisions led to the formation of new denominations and the further fragmentation of American Protestantism. The proliferation of religious groups in colonial America created practical pressures for religious accommodation. Communities needed to decide how to handle situations where different religious groups claimed the same resources or sought exemptions from generally applicable laws. Should Quakers be excused from military service? Should Jews be allowed to serve in public office? Should Catholics be permitted to build churches in Protestant communities? These questions had no easy answers, and different colonies developed different approaches. Some maintained strict religious establishments that privileged one denomination over others. Others adopted policies of broad tolerance that protected religious minorities while maintaining symbolic connections to particular religious traditions. A few experimented with genuine religious freedom that treated all denominations equally before the law. The experience of religious minorities in colonial America was complex and varied. Some groups, like the Quakers in Pennsylvania, achieved significant political influence and social acceptance. Others, like Catholics in most colonies, faced persistent discrimination and legal disabilities. Many smaller sectarian groups found refuge in America, but remained marginalized from mainstream colonial society. The development of religious pluralism in colonial America was not the result of a single policy or theological insight, but emerged from the interaction of multiple factors. The practical impossibility of maintaining religious uniformity across diverse populations, the theological convictions of groups like the Quakers who believed in religious freedom, the economic incentives that made religious tolerance profitable, and the political necessity of maintaining colonial unity despite religious differences. By the time of the American Revolution, the religious landscape of colonial America was unlike anything else in the Christian world. No single denomination could claim majority status across all the colonies. Religious freedom, while not universal, was more extensive than in any European nation. The experience of managing religious diversity had created new institutions and practices that would influence American political development. The seeds of pluralism planted in colonial America would eventually flower into the religious freedom guaranteed by the First Amendment to the Constitution. But that development was not inevitable. It required the continued efforts of religious minorities fighting for their rights, the gradual recognition by colonial leaders that religious diversity could strengthen rather than weaken society, and the creative theological work of thinkers who developed new justifications for religious tolerance. The story of Quakers, Catholics, and other religious dissenters in colonial America demonstrates that religious freedom was not a gift granted by benevolent authorities, but a right claimed by courageous minorities who refused to accept religious oppression. Their struggles and achievements created the foundation for the religious liberty that would become one of America's most distinctive contributions to world civilization. In the winter of 1734, something extraordinary began to happen in the Connecticut River Valley town of Northampton, Massachusetts. Under the preaching of Jonathan Edwards, a brilliant young minister who combined rigorous Calvinist theology with passionate evangelical fervor, the town experienced what Edwards would later describe as a shower of divine blessing. Within months, the revival had spread throughout the valley and beyond, igniting a religious movement that would transform not only American Christianity, but American society itself. The Great Awakening, as historians would later call this period of religious revival, spanning roughly from 1730 to 1750, represented a watershed moment in American religious and cultural development. It was more than a religious phenomenon. It was a social revolution that challenged established authority, promoted individual spiritual experience over institutional control, and helped forge a distinctly American religious identity that would influence the nation's development for generations to come. To understand the significance of the Great Awakening, we must first examine the religious landscape of early 18th century America. The fervor of the original Puritan settlers had cooled considerably by the 1720s. Second- and third-generation colonists, while nominally Christian, often lacked the intense personal faith of their grandparents. Church attendance was declining, and many ministers complained about the worldliness and spiritual indifference of their congregations. The Halfway Covenant of 1662 had already acknowledged this reality by allowing partial church membership for those who could not demonstrate the full conversion experience required of the founding generation. This spiritual declension was particularly troubling to ministers who had been trained in the old Puritan tradition. They saw around them a society that was increasingly prosperous and stable, but seemingly less concerned with eternal salvation. The growing commercialization of colonial life, the increasing contact with secular European culture, and the simple passage of time had eroded the religious intensity that had characterized early New England. Into this context came Jonathan Edwards, perhaps the most intellectually gifted theologian America has ever produced. Edwards had been educated at Yale College and was deeply influenced by both Puritan theology and contemporary European philosophy. He combined a rigorous commitment to Calvinist doctrine with a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and a remarkable ability to communicate complex theological ideas to ordinary people. Edwards's preaching in Northampton began to draw extraordinary responses from his congregation. His sermons, delivered in a calm, reasoned style without theatrical gestures, nonetheless moved listeners to intense emotional responses. People wept openly, cried out in anguish over their sins, and experienced what they described as direct encounters with divine grace. Edwards carefully documented these experiences, becoming one of the first systematic observers of religious psychology in America. The revival in Northampton might have remained a local phenomenon if not for the arrival of George Whitefield, an Anglican evangelist from England who would become the most famous preacher in 18th century America. Whitefield possessed extraordinary oratorical gifts and an unprecedented ability to reach mass audiences. His theatrical preaching style, with its dramatic gestures and emotional appeals, differed markedly from traditional colonial preaching, but proved incredibly effective at moving large crowds to religious conversion. Whitefield's arrival in America in 1739 marked the beginning of the Great Awakening as a truly continental phenomenon. He preached to enormous crowds throughout the colonies, from New England to Georgia, drawing audiences that often numbered in the thousands. His outdoor sermons, necessitated by the inability of any church building to hold the crowds he attracted, broke down traditional barriers between denominations and social classes. Farmers, merchants, slaves, and gentlemen all heard the same message of personal salvation and individual accountability before God. The content of awakening preaching represented a significant departure from traditional colonial religious instruction. Rather than focusing on moral behavior and social responsibility, revival preachers emphasized the necessity of personal conversion, a dramatic, emotional experience in which individuals recognized their sinful nature and accepted God's grace. This new birth was understood as a radical transformation that fundamentally changed a person's relationship with God and their understanding of their place in the world. The famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," delivered by Edwards in 1741, exemplified the theological message of the Great Awakening. Edwards painted a vivid picture of human sinfulness and divine judgment, describing unconverted listeners as spiders dangling over the flames of hell, held only by the slender thread of God's mercy. The sermon's power lay not in its theological novelty. Edwards was preaching orthodox Calvinist doctrine, but in its emotional immediacy and its insistence that each individual must personally experience divine grace. The revival's emphasis on individual religious experience had profound social implications. If salvation depended on personal conversion rather than social status, church membership, or moral behavior, then traditional social hierarchies were called into question. The Great Awakening created space for new forms of religious authority based on spiritual experience rather than formal education or social position. This democratization of religious authority would have lasting effects on American society. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the emergence of women and African Americans as religious leaders during the revival. While most colonial churches restricted public religious roles to white men, the Great Awakening created opportunities for others to exercise spiritual authority. Women like Sarah Osborne in Newport, Rhode Island, led religious meetings in their homes that attracted both black and white participants. African American converts often became powerful preachers and spiritual leaders within both slave and free communities. The revival's impact on African American religious life was particularly significant. While many enslaved people had been exposed to Christianity through their masters' religious practices, the Great Awakening offered a more personal and emotionally satisfying religious experience. Baptist and Methodist preachers, in particular, welcomed African American converts and often allowed them to exercise leadership roles within religious communities. The emotional style of revival preaching resonated with African American cultural traditions, creating forms of Christian expression that would profoundly influence American religious life. The Great Awakening also sparked the first major schism in American Protestantism. The revival divided existing denominations into New Light and Old Light factions, with New Light supporters embracing the emotional, experiential religion of the revival, while Old Light opponents criticized it as enthusiasm and disorder. These divisions were not merely theological, but reflected deeper disagreements about the nature of religious authority, the role of emotion in religious life, and the relationship between church and society. The Presbyterian Church experienced a particularly dramatic split during the Great Awakening. The Synod of Philadelphia divided over questions of ministerial education and the legitimacy of itinerant preaching. New Light Presbyterians, led by ministers like William Tennant Sr. and his sons, established their own schools to train ministers and formed separate presbyteries. This division would persist for decades and establish patterns of denominational fragmentation that would characterize American Protestantism. The revival's challenge to established religious authority extended beyond denominational boundaries to question the entire structure of colonial religious life. Itinerant preachers traveled from town to town, often preaching without permission from local ministers or civil authorities. They criticized established ministers as unconverted and spiritually dead, undermining traditional clerical authority. Some revival preachers even questioned the necessity of a formally educated ministry, arguing that spiritual gifts were more important than academic credentials. These challenges to religious authority had political implications as well. If individuals could challenge ministerial authority based on their personal religious experience, might they not also challenge civil authority? The Great Awakening occurred during a period of increasing tension between the American colonies and British imperial authority, and the revival's emphasis on individual conscience and resistance to corrupt authority resonated with political as well as religious concerns. The institutional legacy of the Great Awakening was enormous. The revival led to the founding of numerous new churches, schools, and colleges. Princeton University was established in 1746 by New Light Presbyterians, while Brown University was founded by Baptists in 1764. These institutions would train generations of American leaders and help establish the intellectual foundations of American higher education. The Great Awakening also contributed to the growth of evangelical denominations that would become central to American religious life. Baptists, who emphasized adult baptism by immersion and congregational church governance, grew rapidly during the revival period. Methodists, who stressed personal holiness and social action, would become the largest Protestant denomination in 19th century America. Both groups traced their American growth to the religious ferment of the Great Awakening. The revival's emphasis on emotional religious experience and individual spiritual authority would have lasting effects on American religious culture. The idea that true religion was a matter of the heart rather than the head, that personal experience was more important than theological sophistication, became deeply embedded in American Christianity. This emphasis on experiential religion would influence American religious life from the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century through contemporary evangelical movements. The Great Awakening also contributed to the development of religious liberty in America. The revival's challenge to established religious authority and its creation of new forms of religious expression made it increasingly difficult to maintain religious uniformity. The multiplication of denominations and the growth of dissenting groups created practical pressures for religious accommodation that would eventually lead to the disestablishment of state churches and the guarantee of religious freedom. The social effects of the Great Awakening extended far beyond the religious sphere. The revival's emphasis on individual conscience and personal responsibility contributed to the development of democratic ideals that would influence American political thought. The experience of challenging established authority in religious matters provided a model for resistance to political authority that would prove important during the American Revolution. The Great Awakening also had complex effects on American social relationships. While the revival's emphasis on spiritual equality challenged some forms of social hierarchy, it also created new forms of religious authority and social division. The intense emotional experiences of the revival could be both liberating and divisive, bringing some communities together while tearing others apart. The revival's impact on American intellectual life was equally significant. The Great Awakening forced American thinkers to grapple with questions about the relationship between reason and emotion, the nature of religious authority, and the role of individual experience in religious life. These questions would continue to influence American philosophy and theology for generations. Critics of the Great Awakening, both contemporary and historical, have pointed to its potentially negative effects. The revival's emphasis on emotional experience over rational reflection could lead to religious enthusiasm and fanaticism. Its challenge to established authority could undermine social stability and promote dangerous individualism. The divisions it created within communities and denominations could be destructive and long-lasting. Yet the Great Awakening's positive contributions to American religious and cultural development are undeniable. The revival democratized religious authority, created new opportunities for spiritual leadership, and established the principle that religious truth could be found through personal experience as well as formal instruction. It contributed to the growth of religious diversity and the development of religious liberty. Most importantly, it helped forge a distinctly American religious identity that emphasized individual spiritual experience, voluntary religious association, and the possibility of personal transformation. The Great Awakening represented a crucial moment in the development of American religious culture. It marked the transition from the inherited religious traditions of European colonialism to a distinctly American form of Christianity characterized by emotional intensity, democratic participation, and institutional diversity. The revival's legacy would influence American religious life from the Second Great Awakening through contemporary evangelical movements, establishing patterns of religious experience and expression that remain central to American Christianity today. As we examine the Great Awakening's role in shaping American religious identity, we see how a movement that began as an effort to revive traditional Puritan piety ultimately transformed American Christianity in revolutionary ways. The revival's emphasis on individual religious experience, its challenge to established authority, and its creation of new forms of religious expression helped establish the foundations of American religious freedom and diversity. The Great Awakening was not merely a religious revival, but a cultural revolution that helped create the religious landscape that would define American spiritual life for centuries to come. The relationship between religious faith and political revolution in 18th century America was complex, multifaceted, and profoundly influential in shaping the character of the new nation. As tensions mounted between the American colonies and the British Empire, religious leaders, institutions, and ideas played crucial roles in both supporting and opposing the movement toward independence. The American Revolution was not fought primarily over religious issues, but religion provided much of the moral framework, intellectual justification, and emotional energy that sustained the revolutionary cause. The religious landscape of colonial America on the eve of revolution was remarkably diverse. Congregationalists dominated New England. Anglicans were established in several southern colonies, Presbyterians were strong in the middle colonies, and various other denominations, Baptists, Methodists, Quakers, Catholics, and numerous smaller sects, competed for adherents throughout the continent. This religious diversity created a situation unique in the Christian world. No single denomination could claim to represent the religious will of the American people. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s had already challenged traditional religious authority and created new forms of religious expression that emphasized individual conscience and personal experience over institutional control. This religious democratization provided a crucial foundation for the political democratization that would follow. The revival's emphasis on individual spiritual authority and its challenge to established religious hierarchies created a cultural context in which challenges to political authority seemed natural and necessary. The specific religious dimensions of the imperial crisis began to emerge in the 1760s as the British government implemented new policies designed to tighten control over the American colonies. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, and subsequent revenue measures were primarily economic and political in nature, but they raised fundamental questions about the relationship between individual conscience and governmental authority that had profound religious implications. Many American ministers began to address political questions from their pulpits, drawing on biblical and theological resources to interpret the imperial crisis. The concept of covenant, which had been central to Puritan political thought since the early 17th century, provided a framework for understanding the relationship between rulers and subjects. According to covenant theology, political authority was legitimate only when it served the common good and respected the fundamental rights that God had granted to all human beings. The Anglican establishment in several southern colonies created additional religious tensions during the imperial crisis. The Church of England was not merely a religious institution, but an arm of the British imperial system, with bishops appointed by the Crown and clergy often serving as political agents of the royal government. Many American Anglicans found themselves torn between their loyalty to their church and their growing opposition to British policies. The question of an American bishop became a particularly contentious issue during the 1760s. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the Anglican missionary organization, had long advocated for the appointment of bishops in America to provide proper ecclesiastical oversight for the growing Anglican Church. However, most American colonists, including many Anglicans, opposed this proposal, fearing that Anglican bishops would be used to impose British control over American religious life. The opposition to Anglican bishops drew support from across the religious spectrum. Congregationalists and Presbyterians, who had fled episcopal authority in England and Scotland, viewed the proposal as a direct threat to their religious freedom. Even moderate Anglicans worried that the appointment of bishops would create new forms of religious and political control that would undermine colonial autonomy. The controversy over bishops became a symbol of broader concerns about British attempts to impose unwanted authority on American colonists. Religious arguments against British policies drew heavily on biblical and theological sources. Ministers preached sermons comparing King George III to biblical tyrants like Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar, while American colonists were cast as modern Israelites suffering under foreign oppression. The Exodus narrative, with its themes of liberation from bondage and divine support for the oppressed, provided a powerful framework for understanding the American situation. The concept of natural rights, which became central to American revolutionary ideology, had important religious dimensions. Many American thinkers argued that human rights were not grants from government, but gifts from God, that no earthly authority could legitimately violate. This theological foundation for natural rights provided a religious justification for resistance to unjust government that transcended denominational boundaries. John Witherspoon, a Presbyterian minister and president of the College of New Jersey, later Princeton University, became one of the most influential religious voices supporting the American cause. Witherspoon argued that resistance to tyranny was not only politically justified, but religiously required. His sermon, The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men, delivered in 1776, provided a theological framework for understanding the American Revolution as part of God's providential plan for human history. The role of Presbyterian and Congregationalist ministers in supporting the revolutionary cause was so prominent that British loyalists referred to the conflict as the Presbyterian War. Ministers like Samuel Davies in Virginia, John Witherspoon in New Jersey, and Samuel Cooper in Massachusetts used their pulpits to advocate for American rights and to provide moral justification for resistance to British authority. These Black Regiment ministers, as they were called because of their black clerical robes, played crucial roles in maintaining morale and commitment to the revolutionary cause. Baptist ministers also emerged as strong supporters of the American Revolution, though their motivations were somewhat different from those of their Presbyterian and Congregationalist colleagues. Baptists had faced persecution in several colonies, particularly Virginia, where the Anglican establishment had used legal means to suppress Baptist preaching and worship. The promise of religious freedom implicit in the American cause appealed strongly to Baptists and other religious minorities who had experienced discrimination under colonial religious establishments. The experience of religious minorities during the imperial crisis highlighted the complex relationship between religious and political freedom. Quakers, who opposed violence on religious grounds, found themselves in a difficult position as the conflict escalated toward war. Many Quakers supported American political rights, but could not endorse violent resistance to British authority. This position led to suspicions about Quaker loyalty and to persecution of Quakers in some areas during the war. Catholics faced even more complex challenges during the Revolutionary period. The Quebec Act of 1774, which guaranteed religious freedom to Catholics in the former French territory, was viewed by many American Protestants as evidence of a British plot to establish Catholicism in America. Anti-Catholic sentiment ran high in many colonies, and Catholics were often viewed with suspicion as potential enemies of American liberty. However, the practical necessities of the Revolutionary War forced Americans to reconsider their attitudes toward Catholics. The need for foreign allies led to the Franco-American Alliance of 1778, which required Americans to work closely with a Catholic power. The service of Catholics like Charles Carroll of Maryland in the Continental Congress and the Continental Army demonstrated that Catholics could be loyal American patriots. The experience of the Revolution began to break down some of the anti-Catholic prejudices that had characterized colonial America. The Declaration of Independence, adopted in July 1776, reflected the religious influences that had shaped American revolutionary thought. The document's famous assertion that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights provided a theological foundation for American political philosophy. While the Declaration was primarily a political document, its religious language reflected the deep influence of Christian thought on American revolutionary ideology. The religious dimensions of the Revolutionary War were evident in the way both sides understood and justified their cause. American patriots viewed the conflict as a righteous war against tyranny, while British loyalists saw it as a rebellion against legitimate authority. Both sides claimed divine support for their cause and interpreted military victories and defeats in providential terms. The Continental Army's survival through the harsh winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778 became a powerful symbol of divine providence supporting the American cause. George Washington's leadership during this crisis was viewed by many Americans as evidence of God's special protection for the revolutionary cause. Washington himself cultivated this image, frequently referring to divine providence in his letters and public statements. The entry of France into the war in 1778 created additional religious complications for American revolutionaries. Many Americans had viewed the conflict as a Protestant struggle against Catholic tyranny, but the French alliance required them to work closely with a Catholic power. This alliance forced Americans to develop more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between religious and political loyalties. The religious impact of the Revolutionary War extended beyond the immediate conflict to influence the development of American religious institutions. The war disrupted traditional religious establishments and created opportunities for new forms of religious expression. The Anglican Church, closely associated with British authority, faced particular challenges as many of its clergy fled to Britain or Canada. The Presbyterian and Congregationalist churches, which had strongly supported the American cause, emerged from the war with enhanced prestige and influence. The war also accelerated the growth of evangelical denominations that emphasized personal religious experience over institutional authority. Baptists and Methodists grew rapidly during the Revolutionary period, appealing to Americans who were attracted to democratic forms of religious expression that paralleled the political democracy they were creating. The question of religious establishments became particularly important as Americans created new state governments during the Revolutionary period. Some states, like Massachusetts and Connecticut, maintained religious establishments that provided public support for particular denominations. Others, like Virginia and Pennsylvania, moved toward religious freedom that treated all denominations equally. These different approaches to religious establishment would influence the development of American religious liberty. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, drafted by Thomas Jefferson in 1777 and adopted by the Virginia legislature in 1786, became a model for religious liberty that would influence the development of American religious freedom. The statute declared that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, and that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion. The religious legacy of the American Revolution was complex and multifaceted. The war had demonstrated that religious diversity was compatible with political unity, and that religious freedom could strengthen rather than weaken society. The experience of fighting together for a common cause had created bonds among Americans of different religious backgrounds that transcended denominational boundaries. At the same time, the revolution had raised fundamental questions about the relationship between religious faith and political loyalty that would continue to influence American development. The war had demonstrated the power of religious conviction to inspire political resistance, but it had also shown the potential for religious differences to create political divisions. The religious influences on American revolutionary thought were evident in the way Americans understood their new nation's role in world history. Many Americans viewed the United States as a new Israel, chosen by God to be a light to the nations and a model of religious and political freedom. This sense of divine mission would influence American foreign policy and national identity for generations to come. The American Revolution represented a crucial turning point in the relationship between religious faith and political authority in the Western world. The success of the American experiment in religious freedom would influence religious and political developments throughout the Atlantic world and beyond. The religious dimensions of the American Revolution were not merely incidental to the political struggle, but were central to the moral and intellectual framework that made American independence possible. As we examine the role of religion in the birth of the American nation, we see how religious faith provided both the motivation and the justification for the revolutionary cause. The religious diversity of colonial America made religious freedom a practical necessity, while religious conviction provided the moral foundation for political resistance. The American Revolution was not a religious war, but it was a conflict deeply influenced by religious ideas and sustained by religious faith. The religious legacy of the Revolution would continue to shape American development long after the last British soldier had departed American shores. The dawn of the 19th century brought with it a new wave of religious fervor that would sweep across the American landscape like wildfire, fundamentally reshaping not only the spiritual life of the nation, but its social, political, and cultural development as well. The Second Great Awakening, spanning roughly from 1790 to 1840, represented a religious revival of unprecedented scope and intensity that would touch virtually every aspect of American life. Unlike its 18th century predecessor, this revival was intimately connected with the westward expansion of the American people and the moral challenges posed by rapid social change. The Second Great Awakening emerged from a complex set of social, economic, and religious factors that characterized the early American Republic. The rational religion of the Enlightenment, which had influenced many of the nation's founders, had made little impact on the religious lives of ordinary Americans. Deism, with its emphasis on reason and natural religion, appealed to intellectuals like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, but failed to provide the emotional satisfaction and community support that most Americans sought from their religious experience. The new nation's rapid westward expansion created additional challenges for traditional religious institutions. As pioneers moved beyond the Appalachian Mountains into the territories of Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and beyond, they left behind the established churches and settled communities that had provided religious stability in the eastern seaboard. The frontier environment, with its isolation, hardship, and social fluidity, created a demand for new forms of religious expression that could adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. The revival began in the 1790s in the scattered settlements of Kentucky and Tennessee, where Presbyterian ministers like James McGrady began preaching a message of personal conversion and emotional religious experience that echoed the themes of the earlier Great Awakening. McGrady's preaching attracted large crowds to outdoor camp meetings, where people would gather for several days of intensive religious activity. These camp meetings became the characteristic institution of the Second Great Awakening, providing a new model for religious revival that could reach scattered populations across the expanding American frontier. The most famous of these early camp meetings occurred at Cane Ridge, Kentucky, in August 1801. The meeting, organized by Presbyterian minister Barton Stone, attracted an estimated 10,000 to 25,000 participants, making it one of the largest gatherings in American history to that point. For 6 days, people camped on the grounds, listening to preaching from multiple ministers representing different denominations, experiencing dramatic conversions, and participating in emotional religious exercises that included shouting, weeping, and physical manifestations of spiritual experience. The Cane Ridge Revival demonstrated several characteristics that would define the Second Great Awakening. First, it was interdenominational, with Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist ministers working together despite their theological differences. Second, it emphasized emotional religious experience over doctrinal precision, welcoming anyone who demonstrated genuine spiritual conversion regardless of their theological sophistication. Third, it created new forms of religious authority that challenged traditional clerical hierarchies, allowing lay preachers and even women to exercise spiritual leadership roles. The Methodist Church emerged as the primary beneficiary of the Second Great Awakening, growing from a small denomination with fewer than 15,000 members in 1784 to the largest Protestant denomination in America by 1850, with over 1.3 million members. The Methodist emphasis on personal holiness, emotional religious experience, and democratic church governance perfectly suited the needs of the expanding American frontier. Methodist circuit riders, traveling preachers who served scattered communities across vast territories, became iconic figures in American religious life. The circuit rider system represented a revolutionary approach to religious ministry that was perfectly adapted to frontier conditions. These itinerant preachers, often young men with minimal formal education but powerful spiritual conviction, traveled on horseback through wilderness areas, establishing new congregations and maintaining contact with isolated communities. They preached in log cabins, schoolhouses, and outdoor settings, adapting their message to the practical concerns of frontier life while maintaining the essential Methodist emphasis on personal conversion and Christian perfection. Francis Asbury, the first Methodist bishop in America, played a crucial role in organizing and directing this expansion. Asbury himself traveled over 270,000 miles on horseback during his career, visiting Methodist communities throughout the country and ordaining hundreds of circuit riders. His leadership established the Methodist Church as a truly national denomination that could adapt to the diverse conditions of American life. The Baptist Church also grew rapidly during the Second Great Awakening, though through different methods than the Methodists. Baptist emphasis on congregational independence and democratic church governance appealed to Americans who valued individual freedom and local control. The Baptist practice of adult baptism by immersion provided a dramatic ritual that matched the emotional intensity of revival conversions. Baptist farmer preachers, who worked their land during the week and preached on Sundays, became important community leaders throughout the South and West. The Second Great Awakening was not confined to the frontier, but also had profound impacts in the established communities of the Eastern Seaboard. In New England, the revival took on a more intellectual character, combining emotional religious experience with systematic theological reflection. Charles Grandison Finney, who became the most famous revivalist of the period, developed new methods of conducting revivals that could be adapted to urban settings. Finney's new measures included protracted meetings that lasted for several days, the anxious bench, where those seeking conversion could receive special attention, and direct, personal appeals to individuals in the congregation. These techniques were controversial among traditional clergy, who worried that Finney was manipulating religious emotions rather than allowing the Holy Spirit to work naturally. However, Finney's methods proved highly effective, and his revivals in Rochester, New York, and other cities demonstrated that the awakening could succeed in urban as well as rural settings. The Second Great Awakening had profound effects on American social reform movements. The revival's emphasis on personal conversion and Christian perfection led naturally to efforts to perfect society as well as individuals. The concept of disinterested benevolence, developed by New England theologians like Samuel Hopkins and Nathaniel Emmons, provided a theological foundation for social reform that would influence American activism for generations. The temperance movement, which sought to eliminate alcohol consumption from American life, emerged directly from the Second Great Awakening. Revival preachers regularly denounced alcohol as a source of moral corruption and social disorder. The American Temperance Society, founded in 1826, drew its leadership primarily from evangelical Protestant churches and used revival techniques to promote abstinence from alcohol. The movement's success in reducing alcohol consumption demonstrated the potential for religious conviction to drive social change. The abolition movement also drew heavily on the religious energy of the Second Great Awakening. Evangelical Protestants increasingly came to view slavery as a sin that contradicted fundamental Christian principles of human equality and divine love. The revival's emphasis on personal conversion and moral transformation provided a framework for understanding slavery as a moral evil that required immediate elimination rather than gradual reform. Theodore Dwight Weld, one of the most effective abolition speakers, was converted during Finney's revivals and explicitly connected his anti-slavery work to his religious faith. Weld and other evangelical abolitionists argued that slavery was not merely a political or economic issue, but a moral question that required Christian response. This religious foundation for anti-slavery activism would provide the moral energy that sustained the abolition movement through decades of opposition and violence. The Second Great Awakening also sparked new interest in foreign missions and world evangelization. The revival's emphasis on personal conversion and Christian responsibility led many American Christians to feel called to spread the gospel to non-Christian peoples around the world. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, established in 1810, represented the first systematic effort to organize American foreign missionary activity. The first American foreign missionaries, including Adoniram Judson and Anne Hasseltine Judson, who went to Burma in 1812, embodied the revival's combination of personal piety and social activism. Their work established patterns of American missionary activity that would influence American foreign relations and global Christianity for generations. The missionary movement also contributed to the development of American higher education, as churches established colleges to train missionaries and ministers. The role of women in the Second Great Awakening was both expanded and constrained by the revival's emphasis on personal religious experience. While most denominations continued to restrict formal ministerial roles to men, the revival created new opportunities for women to exercise religious leadership. Women could share their conversion experiences in religious meetings, lead prayer groups, and participate in various forms of Christian service that had previously been limited to men. Some women, like Phoebe Palmer in the Methodist Church, became influential religious leaders who attracted large followings and exercised significant authority within their denominations. Palmer's emphasis on entire sanctification, the Methodist doctrine that Christians could achieve perfect holiness in this life, influenced Methodist theology and practice throughout the 19th century. Her writings and speaking tours made her one of the most influential religious figures of her era. The Second Great Awakening also had important effects on American political development. The revival's emphasis on personal moral responsibility and social reform created a religiously motivated political activism that would influence American politics throughout the 19th century. The idea that government should promote moral behavior and that Christians had a responsibility to participate in political life became central themes in American political culture. The Anti-Masonic Party, which emerged in the late 1820s, represented one of the earliest examples of religiously motivated political organization. The party's opposition to Freemasonry was based on evangelical Protestant concerns about secret societies and their potential threat to Christian values. While the Anti-Masonic Party was short-lived, it demonstrated the potential for religious conviction to create new forms of political organization. The Second Great Awakening's influence on American religious life was profound and lasting. The revival established evangelicalism as the dominant form of American Protestantism, emphasizing personal conversion experience, biblical authority, and active Christian service. The denominational patterns established during the revival, Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian dominance, would characterize American Protestantism well into the 20th century. The revival also established new patterns of religious organization that emphasized voluntary association and democratic participation. The idea that religious institutions should be supported by voluntary contributions rather than government funding became central to American religious life. The development of religious voluntary societies, organizations dedicated to specific reform causes like temperance, abolition, and missions, created new forms of religious activism that could mobilize large numbers of people for social change. The theological legacy of the Second Great Awakening was equally significant. The revival's emphasis on free will and human ability to choose salvation challenged traditional Calvinist doctrines of predestination and limited atonement. Ministers like Charles Finney developed new theological positions that emphasized human responsibility for salvation, while maintaining the necessity of divine grace. This new school theology would influence American Protestant thought throughout the 19th century. The Second Great Awakening's connection to westward expansion was not merely coincidental, but represented a fundamental aspect of American religious development. The revival provided a religious framework for understanding American expansion as part of God's plan for the nation. The idea that America had a special role in world history, a manifest destiny to spread freedom and Christianity across the continent, drew heavily on the religious energy of the revival. The revival also helped create the religious institutions that would serve expanding American communities. The denominational organizations established during the Awakening, Methodist conferences, Baptist associations, and Presbyterian synods, provided the structure for religious life in new territories. The emphasis on lay leadership and democratic organization meant that religious communities could be quickly established in frontier areas without waiting for formally trained clergy. The Second Great Awakening represented a crucial phase in the development of American religious identity. The revival established patterns of religious experience and organization that would characterize American Christianity for generations. Its emphasis on personal conversion, social reform, and democratic participation created a uniquely American form of Christianity that combined evangelical fervor with social activism. The revival's influence extended far beyond the religious sphere to shape American culture, politics, and social development. The idea that individuals could be transformed through religious experience and that society could be perfected through Christian reform became central themes in American thought. The Second Great Awakening provided the religious foundation for the reform movements that would dominate American social life in the antebellum period, and the moral framework that would ultimately lead to the Civil War. As we examine the Second Great Awakening's role in American religious development, we see how a religious revival became a crucial factor in the nation's westward expansion and social transformation. The awakening was not merely a religious phenomenon, but a cultural revolution that helped create the distinctive characteristics of American civilization. Its legacy would continue to influence American religious and social life long after the revival fires had died down. Perhaps no issue in American history has more clearly revealed the complex relationship between religious faith and social justice than the institution of slavery. For over 2 centuries, American Christians struggled to reconcile their beliefs about human dignity, divine love, and moral responsibility with the brutal reality of a society built on the systematic oppression of millions of human beings. The story of how American religious communities responded to slavery illuminates both the highest aspirations and the deepest failures of American Christianity, demonstrating how religious faith can serve as both an instrument of liberation and a tool of oppression. The arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia in 1619 created a moral crisis that would challenge American Christianity for generations. The contradiction between Christian teachings about human equality before God and the practical reality of slavery was apparent from the beginning, but the economic benefits of slave labor and the social structures that supported it proved powerful enough to overcome most religious objections for more than 2 centuries. Early colonial Christianity's relationship with slavery was shaped by several factors that made acceptance of the institution easier for white Christians to rationalize. The prevailing theological understanding of the time emphasized divine sovereignty and the acceptance of earthly conditions as part of God's plan. Many Christians interpreted social hierarchies, including slavery, as divinely ordained institutions that should be accepted rather than challenged. The curse of Ham, a biblical narrative that was twisted to justify African slavery, provided a religious rationale for racial oppression that persisted well into the modern era. The conversion of enslaved Africans to Christianity created additional complications for American religious communities. While some masters initially resisted the conversion of their slaves, fearing that baptism might imply equal status or even freedom, most Christian denominations developed theological arguments that separated spiritual equality from social equality. Enslaved people could be equal in God's sight while remaining subordinate in earthly society, according to this reasoning. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, the Anglican missionary organization, was particularly active in promoting Christianity among enslaved populations. The Society's missionaries established schools for enslaved children and adults, teaching them to read so they could study the Bible. However, the religious instruction provided to enslaved people was carefully designed to reinforce rather than challenge their social status. Biblical passages emphasizing obedience to masters and acceptance of earthly conditions were heavily emphasized, while themes of liberation and justice were largely ignored. Despite these limitations, the Christianization of enslaved Africans had profound and often unintended consequences. African Americans developed their own interpretations of Christian teaching that emphasized themes of liberation, justice, and divine deliverance. The Exodus narrative, with its story of God's liberation of the Israelites from Egyptian bondage, held special significance for enslaved Christians who saw clear parallels between their situation and that of the biblical Israelites. The development of African American Christianity represented a creative synthesis of Christian theology with African spiritual traditions and the lived experience of slavery. Enslaved Christians developed distinctive forms of worship that included spirituals, ring shouts, and other expressions that drew on both African and Christian traditions. These religious practices provided not only spiritual comfort, but also a means of maintaining cultural identity and community solidarity under conditions of severe oppression. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s had complex effects on the religious dimensions of slavery. The revival's emphasis on personal conversion and spiritual equality created space for some challenges to slavery, but it also provided new religious frameworks that could be used to justify the institution. Some revival preachers, like George Whitefield, owned enslaved people while preaching about spiritual equality, demonstrating the ways in which religious conviction could coexist with moral blindness. The year was 1847, and Patrick O'Malley clutched his rosary beads as the ship carrying him and hundreds of other Irish immigrants approached the shores of New York Harbor. Behind him lay the devastation of the Great Famine. Ahead lay an uncertain future, in a land that many of his Protestant neighbours had warned him would never accept his Catholic faith. Patrick could not have imagined that his journey was part of one of the most dramatic religious transformations in American history, a transformation that would see the nation's spiritual landscape evolve from a predominantly Protestant society to one of the most religiously diverse in the world. The great waves of immigration that swept across America from the mid-19th century through the early 20th century brought with them not just new languages, customs and cuisines, but entire religious traditions that had never before taken root in American soil. These new arrivals would challenge the Protestant establishment, force a redefinition of what it meant to be American, and ultimately expand the very concept of religious freedom in ways the Founding Fathers could never have anticipated. The Irish immigration of the 1840s and 1850s marked the beginning of this religious revolution. Driven by poverty and famine, over 1 million Irish Catholics arrived in America during this decade alone. They encountered a nation where anti-Catholic sentiment ran deep, where Protestant ministers preached that the Pope was the Antichrist, and where political movements like the Know Nothing Party explicitly sought to prevent Catholic participation in American political life. The phrase, "Irish need not apply," became common in job advertisements, and Catholic churches were sometimes burned by angry Protestant mobs. Yet the Irish Catholics persevered, establishing parishes, building schools, and creating a parallel religious infrastructure that would serve their community for generations to come. They brought with them a particular form of Catholicism shaped by centuries of oppression under British Protestant rule, a faith that was deeply devotional, suspicious of secular authority, and fiercely protective of its traditions. Irish priests, nuns, and brothers became the backbone of American Catholic education, establishing thousands of parochial schools across the nation. The Catholic challenge to Protestant America was not merely numerical, though the numbers were indeed staggering. By 1860, Catholicism had become the largest single religious denomination in the United States, a position it has maintained ever since. More fundamentally, Catholicism represented a completely different understanding of Christianity, one that emphasized tradition alongside Scripture, maintained a hierarchical structure with the Pope at its head, and practiced devotions that many Protestants viewed as superstitious or even idolatrous. The German immigration of the same period brought additional complexity to American Catholicism. German Catholics often clashed with their Irish coreligionists over language, customs, and approaches to faith. The Germans established their own parishes, conducted services in German, and maintained stronger connections to European Catholic intellectual traditions. They also brought with them a more socially conscious form of Catholicism that would later influence the development of Catholic social teaching in America. But German immigration also brought significant Protestant elements. German Lutherans established their own synods and seminaries, maintaining their distinctive theological traditions while gradually adapting to American religious culture. German Reformed churches, Mennonites, and other Protestant groups added to the growing diversity of American Protestantism. The German concept of Gemeinschaft, community, influenced American religious life in ways that extended far beyond German immigrant communities. The late 19th century saw the arrival of new Catholic populations from Eastern and Southern Europe. Italian immigrants brought with them a more festive and folk-oriented Catholicism that often alarmed both Protestant Americans and Irish Catholic clergy. Italian religious festivals, with their processions, music, and celebrations, seemed foreign and exotic to American observers. Polish Catholics established their own parishes and schools, maintaining their language and customs while slowly integrating into American Catholic life. Perhaps most challenging to existing American religious categories were the Eastern European immigrants who brought with them Orthodox Christianity. Russian, Greek, Serbian, and other Orthodox communities established churches that looked and sounded unlike anything most Americans had ever experienced. With their elaborate liturgies, married priests, and different calendar of holy days, Orthodox churches represented yet another way of being Christian in America. The iconoclastic controversies that had raged in Eastern Christianity centuries earlier now played out in American cities where Orthodox churches displayed elaborate icons while neighboring Protestant churches maintained their stark, unadorned worship spaces. Orthodox theology, with its emphasis on theosis, the deification of humanity, and its different understanding of original sin, challenged both Protestant and Catholic theological assumptions. Jewish immigration added another dimension entirely to American religious diversity. While small Jewish communities had existed in America since colonial times, the massive influx of Eastern European Jews fleeing pogroms and persecution in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created substantial Jewish populations in major American cities. These immigrants brought with them not just their religion, but their own internal religious divisions. Orthodox Jews maintained strict observance of traditional Jewish law, establishing synagogues, schools, and ritual facilities that allowed them to practice their faith fully in the American context. Conservative Jews sought to adapt traditional Judaism to modern American life while maintaining its essential character. Reform Jews, influenced by German Jewish intellectual traditions, embraced a more liberal interpretation of Judaism that emphasized ethical teachings over ritual observance. The presence of substantial Jewish populations forced Christian Americans to confront their own theological assumptions about Jews and Judaism. While anti-Semitism remained a persistent problem, the day-to-day interaction between Jewish and Christian neighbors in American cities created opportunities for mutual understanding that had rarely existed in European contexts. Asian immigration, though numerically smaller initially, brought entirely non-Christian religions to American shores. Chinese immigrants, beginning with the California Gold Rush and continuing through the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, brought with them Buddhist and Confucian traditions. Chinatowns became centers not just of Chinese culture, but of Chinese religious practice, with temples and religious associations serving immigrant communities. Japanese immigration introduced Americans to different forms of Buddhism, as well as to Shinto traditions. The elegant simplicity of Japanese Buddhist temples contrasted sharply with the ornate decoration of Chinese Buddhist temples, illustrating the diversity that existed even within individual religious traditions. The arrival of these new faiths created practical challenges that forced American society to expand its understanding of religious accommodation. Questions arose about ritual slaughter of animals for kosher or halal food, about religious observance conflicting with standard work schedules, about the teaching of religion in public schools where children from many faith traditions now studied together. The Catholic Church faced particular challenges in adapting to American religious culture. The Vatican's suspicion of democracy and religious freedom put American Catholics in a difficult position. They had to demonstrate loyalty to both their faith and their country. The appointment of Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul as a leading voice for Catholic Americanization helped resolve this tension. Ireland argued that Catholicism and American democracy were compatible, even mutually reinforcing. The emergence of Catholic universities like Georgetown, Notre Dame, and the Catholic University of America demonstrated the community's commitment to American education while maintaining distinctive Catholic identity. Catholic scholars began making significant contributions to American intellectual life, challenging Protestant assumptions about the relationship between faith and reason. The growth of Catholic political influence also changed American politics. Catholic voters became a crucial constituency in many urban areas, and Catholic politicians began rising to positions of prominence. The election of Catholic governors and mayors demonstrated that religious prejudice, while still present, was not insurmountable in American political life. Protestant America responded to this religious diversification in various ways. Some embraced what they saw as an opportunity to demonstrate American religious freedom and tolerance. Others retreated into defensive postures, viewing non-Protestant religions as threats to American Christian civilization. The founding of the American Protective Association in 1887 represented the organized nativist response to Catholic immigration, while the rise of the social gospel movement among Protestant churches represented a more positive engagement with the challenges of urban, multicultural America. The establishment of institutions like the Federal Council of Churches in 1908 reflected Protestant efforts to maintain unity and influence in an increasingly diverse religious landscape. At the same time, Protestant missions to immigrants sought to convert newcomers to Protestant Christianity, viewing this as both a religious duty and a means of cultural assimilation. The First World War marked a crucial turning point in American attitudes toward religious diversity. The common sacrifice of Americans from all religious backgrounds in the war effort helped break down some religious barriers. Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish chaplains served side by side in the military, and the shared experience of wartime service created new bonds across religious lines. The war also accelerated the Americanization of immigrant religious communities. German-language services largely disappeared from Lutheran churches, and Catholic parishes increasingly conducted services in English rather than in the languages of their immigrant founders. The suspicion directed toward hyphenated Americans during the war forced religious communities to demonstrate their American patriotism more clearly. By 1920, American religious diversity had been fundamentally transformed. The Protestant establishment, while still influential, could no longer claim to represent the religious views of all Americans. Catholic and Jewish communities had established themselves as permanent features of American religious life, with their own institutions, leaders, and political influence. Eastern Orthodox churches had found their place in American Christianity, and Asian religious traditions had established their first American footholds. This religious diversification had profound implications for American culture and politics. The public school system, originally designed to transmit Protestant values, had to adapt to serve children from many religious backgrounds. Political parties had to appeal to voters with diverse religious loyalties. American literature, art, and music began reflecting the nation's religious diversity. The expansion of American religious diversity also influenced American foreign policy. Catholic Americans maintained interest in Vatican policies and Catholic countries, Jewish Americans became concerned with Jewish communities worldwide, and Eastern Orthodox Americans followed developments in their countries of origin. American religious pluralism began to connect the United States to global religious communities in new ways. Perhaps most importantly, the immigration of diverse religious communities forced Americans to grapple more seriously with the meaning of religious freedom. The comfortable Protestant consensus of the early 19th century gave way to a more complex understanding of what it meant to guarantee religious liberty in a truly pluralistic society. The challenges and opportunities created by this religious diversification would continue to shape American life well into the 20th century and beyond. The story of Patrick O'Malley and millions of other religious immigrants to America was not just a story of individual faith journeys, but a story of national transformation. In welcoming, sometimes reluctantly, these new religious communities, America was forced to live up to its founding ideals of religious freedom in ways that its founders could never have imagined. The melting pot was not just cultural and ethnic, but profoundly spiritual as well. On a cold January morning in 1802, President Thomas Jefferson sat at his desk in the President's house, carefully crafting what would become one of the most influential letters in American religious history. Writing to the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut, Jefferson penned the phrase that would echo through centuries of American constitutional law. The First Amendment had erected a wall of separation between church and state. Little did Jefferson know that this private correspondence would become the foundation for countless legal battles, political debates, and cultural conflicts that continue to shape American society today. The story of church-state separation in America begins not with Jefferson's letter, but with the remarkable religious diversity and conflict that characterized the American colonies. Unlike European nations where a single established church dominated religious life, America had been settled by groups fleeing religious persecution and seeking to practice their faith freely. This diversity created both opportunities and tensions that would ultimately lead to a uniquely American solution to the ancient problem of religion and government. The Founding Fathers faced an unprecedented challenge: how to create a government that could command the loyalty of citizens from dozens of different religious traditions while avoiding the religious wars that had plagued Europe for centuries. Their solution was revolutionary: a government that would neither establish any religion nor prohibit the free exercise of religion. But the implementation of this principle would prove far more complex than its articulation. James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, played a crucial role in developing the American approach to church-state relations. His experience in Virginia, where he witnessed the persecution of Baptist ministers by the Anglican establishment, convinced him that religious freedom required not just tolerance, but complete separation of religious and governmental authority. Madison's memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments argued that religion must be left to the conscience of the individual, free from governmental interference or support. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, authored by Jefferson and championed by Madison, became the model for the First Amendment's approach to religion. Jefferson's statute declared that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, and that civil rights should not depend on religious opinions. This radical proposition challenged centuries of European tradition that assumed governmental authority required religious unity. When the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, its 16 words about religion, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," seemed clear enough. But almost immediately, questions arose about their practical application. Did the prohibition against establishment apply only to Congress or to all levels of government? Did it prevent only the establishment of a single national church, or did it forbid any governmental support for religion? What constituted the free exercise of religion, and what happened when free exercise claims conflicted with generally applicable laws? The early American experience with church-state separation was complicated by the fact that many individual states maintained established churches well into the 19th century. Massachusetts did not disestablish the Congregational Church until 1833, and several other New England states maintained forms of religious establishment for decades after the ratification of the First Amendment. This created a complex federal system where the national government maintained strict separation, while state and local governments continued various forms of church-state cooperation. The presidency of Thomas Jefferson marked the first major test of the separation principle. Jefferson's election in 1800 was bitterly opposed by Federalist clergy who viewed him as an atheist and a threat to American Christianity. They pointed to his friendship with French revolutionaries, his support for religious freedom, and his scientific interests as evidence of his hostility to religion. Jefferson's response was to demonstrate that a president could maintain personal religious beliefs while scrupulously avoiding any governmental support for or interference with religion. Jefferson's approach to presidential religious observance established precedents that would influence American political culture for generations. Unlike his predecessors, Jefferson refused to proclaim national days of fasting and prayer, arguing that such proclamations violated the separation of church and state. He attended church services regularly, but chose different denominations on different Sundays, demonstrating his respect for religious diversity. His correspondence with religious leaders emphasized his personal faith while maintaining strict boundaries between his religious beliefs and his governmental duties. The Jeffersonian model of church-state separation faced its first major challenge during the presidency of John Quincy Adams. Adams, unlike Jefferson, was comfortable with more religious rhetoric in his public pronouncements and was willing to proclaim days of national thanksgiving. Critics argued that Adams was abandoning the Jeffersonian precedent, while supporters contended that he was maintaining appropriate respect for the religious character of the American people while avoiding formal establishment. The rise of evangelical Protestantism in the early 19th century created new tensions around church-state separation. The Second Great Awakening generated intense religious enthusiasm that often spilled over into political activism. Evangelical Christians began organizing to promote moral reform through governmental action, challenging the notion that religion and politics should be kept separate. The temperance movement, efforts to halt mail delivery on Sundays, and campaigns against slavery all involved religious groups seeking to influence government policy based on their theological convictions. The Sunday mail controversy of the 1820s and 1830s represented one of the first major church-state conflicts in American history. Religious groups, led by Presbyterian minister Lyman Beecher, launched a campaign to prevent the Postal Service from operating on Sundays, arguing that such operations violated the Christian Sabbath. The controversy generated enormous public debate and thousands of petitions to Congress. Senator Richard Johnson of Kentucky delivered what became known as the Sunday Mail Report, defending the government's right to operate on Sundays and arguing that stopping such operations would constitute a religious establishment. Johnson's report articulated a robust defense of church-state separation, arguing that the government could not favor the religious observances of some citizens over others. The controversy established important precedents about the limits of religious influence on government policy. The growth of Catholic immigration in the mid-19th century created new challenges for American church-state separation. Protestant Americans had generally been comfortable with a generic, non-sectarian Christianity in public life, but the arrival of large numbers of Catholics forced a more rigorous examination of what constituted religious neutrality. The school wars of the 19th century brought these tensions to a head. Public schools in the 19th century routinely included religious instruction based on Protestant Christianity. Students read from the King James Bible, recited Protestant prayers, and learned history from a Protestant perspective. Catholic parents objected to what they saw as sectarian instruction that violated their religious beliefs and demanded either religious neutrality in public schools or public funding for Catholic schools. The Philadelphia Bible riots of 1844 demonstrated the explosive potential of these religious tensions. When the Philadelphia School Board agreed to allow Catholic students to use the Catholic Bible in school, Protestant mobs attacked Catholic neighborhoods, burned churches, and killed over 20 people. The riots shocked the nation and demonstrated the need for clearer principles governing religion in public institutions. The response to the school wars was the development of what historian Stephen Green has called Protestant non-denominationalism, an approach that claimed to be religiously neutral while actually privileging Protestant Christianity. This approach allowed for Bible reading and prayer in schools while claiming that such practices were not sectarian because they did not favor any particular Protestant denomination. Catholics and other non-Protestants correctly recognized this as a sham neutrality that discriminated against their religious beliefs. The Civil War created new tensions around church-state separation as both North and South claimed divine sanction for their causes. Abraham Lincoln navigated these tensions carefully, using religious language in his public pronouncements while avoiding claims that God was exclusively on the Union side. Lincoln's second inaugural address, with its humble acknowledgement that the Almighty has his own purposes, represented a masterful balancing of religious sentiment with political prudence. The post-Civil War period saw the rise of what historian Philip Hamburger has called the separation of church and state, as a distinctly American constitutional principle. The 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under law raised questions about whether state-level religious establishments violated constitutional principles. The Blaine Amendment, proposed in 1875, would have explicitly prohibited states from funding religious institutions, but it failed to achieve ratification despite strong Protestant support. The late 19th century witnessed growing Protestant anxiety about Catholic influence in American politics. The American Protective Association and similar organizations promoted strict church-state separation as a means of limiting Catholic political power. This created the paradoxical situation where separation of church and state was simultaneously championed by secular liberals concerned about religious influence in politics and by Protestant conservatives concerned about Catholic influence in politics. The emergence of public education as a major governmental function in the late 19th century created new church-state challenges. As public schools became more common and more centralized, questions arose about religious instruction, religious symbols, and religious holidays in educational settings. The development of normal schools and universities to train teachers raised questions about whether religious perspectives should be included in professional education. The rise of the social gospel movement in the early 20th century challenged traditional understandings of church-state separation by arguing that religious principles should guide social reform efforts. Social gospel advocates like Walter Rauschenbusch argued that Christianity required governmental action to address social problems like poverty, inequality, and labor exploitation. This theological perspective influenced progressive-era reforms, but also raised questions about the appropriate role of religious conviction in shaping public policy. World War I created new tensions around church-state separation as the government sought to mobilize religious communities for the war effort. The Committee on Public Information worked closely with religious leaders to promote support for the war, while the military established chaplain services for different religious communities. Critics argued that such cooperation violated separation principles, while supporters contended that accommodating religious needs was necessary for military effectiveness. The 1920s saw the emergence of new church-state conflicts as technological and social changes created novel situations not anticipated by the founders. The rise of radio broadcasting raised questions about religious programming on publicly licensed airwaves. The growth of federal social programs raised questions about cooperation between government agencies and religious organizations in providing social services. The Scopes trial of 1925 represented a watershed moment in American church-state relations. The trial of John Scopes for teaching evolution in a Tennessee public school highlighted the tension between religious authority and scientific knowledge in public education. While the trial ended in Scopes's conviction, the national publicity surrounding the case demonstrated the growing cultural power of secular intellectuals and the defensive position of traditional religious authorities. The Great Depression created new challenges for church-state separation as the federal government expanded its role in providing social services. New Deal programs often cooperated with religious organizations in addressing unemployment, poverty, and social dislocation. The Civilian Conservation Corps, Works Progress Administration, and other agencies worked with churches and religious organizations while attempting to maintain religious neutrality. The Supreme Court's decision in Everson v. Board of Education in 1947 marked a crucial turning point in the legal understanding of church-state separation. Justice Hugo Black's majority opinion incorporated Jefferson's wall of separation metaphor into constitutional law and applied the Establishment Clause to state and local governments through the 14th Amendment. The decision established strict neutrality as the constitutional standard, while also recognizing that some forms of accommodation were necessary in a religiously diverse society. The Everson decision began what scholars call the modern era of church-state jurisprudence, characterized by increasingly detailed Supreme Court scrutiny of government actions affecting religion. Subsequent decisions addressed prayer in public schools, government aid to religious institutions, religious symbols on public property, and numerous other church-state issues. The legacy of the Founding Fathers' approach to church-state separation continues to shape American life in profound ways. The principle that government should neither establish religion nor prohibit its free exercise has allowed American society to accommodate extraordinary religious diversity while maintaining social peace. At the same time, the practical application of this principle continues to generate controversy and debate as American society becomes ever more religiously diverse, and as the role of government in daily life continues to expand. Jefferson's wall of separation has proven to be not a solid barrier but a complex boundary that must be continually negotiated and renegotiated as circumstances change. The constitutional legacy of church-state separation remains one of America's most distinctive contributions to the global understanding of religious freedom and governmental authority. The sanctuary of New York's Riverside Church buzzed with anticipation on May 21, 1922, as one of America's most famous preachers stepped to the pulpit. Harry Emerson Fosdick, minister of First Presbyterian Church, but preaching that day as a guest, delivered a sermon that would ignite a firestorm across American Christianity. His message, titled "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?", challenged the growing conservative movement within Protestant churches and articulated a liberal theological vision that embraced modern science, biblical criticism, and social reform. Fosdick could not have known that his sermon would help crystallize a religious and cultural battle that would define American Christianity for the rest of the 20th century. The early 20th century marked a period of unprecedented upheaval in American religious life. The comfortable Protestant consensus that had dominated American culture for centuries faced challenges from multiple directions. Scientific discoveries that seemed to contradict religious teachings, biblical scholarship that questioned traditional interpretations of Scripture, massive immigration that brought non-Protestant religions to American shores, and social changes that challenged traditional moral authorities. The response to these challenges would split American Christianity into competing camps and transform the relationship between religion and American culture. The roots of the modernist fundamentalist controversy lay in the intellectual ferment of the late 19th century. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, published in On the Origin of Species in 1859, challenged traditional understanding of human origins and divine creation. While some religious leaders found ways to reconcile evolutionary theory with Christian faith, others saw evolution as a direct attack on biblical authority and Christian doctrine. Equally challenging was the rise of higher criticism in biblical scholarship. German scholars like Julius Wellhausen applied historical and literary analysis to biblical texts, questioning traditional assumptions about authorship, composition, and historical accuracy. When these methods were adopted by American scholars and seminarians, they created profound anxiety among conservative Christians who viewed the Bible as the inerrant Word of God. The social gospel movement, which had emerged in the late 19th century, represented another challenge to traditional Christianity. Led by figures like Walter Rauschenbusch and Washington Gladden, social gospel advocates argued that Christianity required active engagement with social problems like poverty, inequality, and injustice. They emphasized the social implications of Jesus' teachings and called for Christian involvement in progressive reform movements. Conservative Christians responded to these challenges by articulating what became known as fundamentalism. Between 1910 and 1915, a series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals was distributed to Protestant ministers across America, funded by California oil millionaires Lyman and Milton Stewart. These pamphlets defended traditional Christian doctrines against modernist challenges and articulated what fundamentalists considered the essential, non-negotiable truths of Christianity. The 5 points that became central to fundamentalist theology were the inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture, the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, the substitutionary atonement, and the physical resurrection and bodily return of Christ. These doctrines were presented not as theological opinions, but as fundamental truths that defined authentic Christianity. Anyone who questioned these beliefs was considered a modernist and potentially not a true Christian. World War I intensified these religious tensions in unexpected ways. Many Americans saw the war as a conflict between Christian civilization and German barbarism, but the unprecedented destruction and apparent meaninglessness of the conflict challenged traditional beliefs about divine providence and human progress. Some religious leaders responded by emphasizing God's judgment on human sinfulness, while others questioned traditional theological explanations of suffering and evil. The post-war period saw the modernist fundamentalist controversy explode into public view. The Northern Baptist Convention and Presbyterian Church in the USA became battlegrounds between conservative and liberal factions. Fundamentalists organized to gain control of denominational institutions, seminaries, and missionary societies, while modernists defended academic freedom and theological diversity. The controversy reached its most famous expression in the Scopes trial of 1925. When Tennessee passed a law prohibiting the teaching of evolution in public schools, the American Civil Liberties Union recruited John Scopes, a high school biology teacher, to challenge the law. The resulting trial became a media spectacle that pitted William Jennings Bryan, the three-time presidential candidate and fundamentalist champion, against Clarence Darrow, the famous defense attorney and religious skeptic. The trial, covered by radio and national newspapers, exposed the growing cultural divide between urban, educated, secular Americans and rural, religious, traditional Americans. While Bryan technically won the case, Scopes was convicted and fined. The trial was widely seen as a victory for modernism and a defeat for fundamentalism. Bryan's fumbling defense of biblical literalism under Darrow's cross-examination made fundamentalists appear ignorant and backward to many educated Americans. The aftermath of the Scopes trial marked a turning point in American religious culture. Fundamentalists largely withdrew from mainstream cultural engagement, focusing instead on building separate institutions: Bible colleges, seminaries, radio stations, and publishing houses. This withdrawal created what historian Joel Carpenter has called the fundamentalist ghetto, a parallel religious culture that maintained traditional beliefs while remaining largely invisible to mainstream American society. Modernist Protestantism, meanwhile, became increasingly identified with mainstream American culture. Liberal Protestant denominations like the Northern Baptist Convention, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and various Presbyterian bodies embraced modern biblical scholarship, evolutionary theory, and progressive social causes. Their leaders became prominent figures in American intellectual and cultural life, serving on university faculties, writing for national magazines, and advising government officials. The rise of neo-orthodoxy in the 1930s and 1940s complicated this religious landscape. Led by theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr and influenced by European thinkers like Karl Barth, neo-orthodoxy offered a middle way between fundamentalism and modernism. Neo-orthodox theologians accepted modern biblical criticism and scientific discoveries while maintaining core Christian doctrines about sin, redemption, and divine transcendence. Reinhold Niebuhr became perhaps the most influential American theologian of the mid-20th century, articulating a Christian realism that acknowledged the persistence of sin in human nature while maintaining hope for social progress. Niebuhr's theology influenced political leaders like Hubert Humphrey and civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., demonstrating the continued relevance of Christian thought to American public life. The Great Depression created new challenges and opportunities for American religious communities. The economic crisis led many Americans to question the optimistic assumptions of liberal Protestantism about human progress and social improvement. At the same time, the desperate need for social services created opportunities for religious organizations to demonstrate their relevance to contemporary problems. Pentecostalism emerged as a significant force in American Christianity during this period. Beginning with the Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles in 1906, Pentecostalism emphasized direct personal experience of God through gifts like speaking in tongues, divine healing, and prophecy. Pentecostal churches grew rapidly among poor and working-class Americans, both white and African American, offering an alternative to both liberal and fundamentalist Protestantism. The distinctive characteristics of Pentecostalism, emotional worship, expectation of miracles, and emphasis on personal religious experience, appealed to Americans seeking authentic spiritual experiences in an increasingly secular and bureaucratic society. Pentecostal evangelists like Amy Semple McPherson became celebrities, using radio and publicity to spread their message to national audiences. World War II created new opportunities for religious engagement with American culture. Military chaplains from different religious traditions served together, creating unprecedented cooperation between Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish clergy. The shared sacrifice of war helped break down some religious barriers and created what sociologist Will Herberg would later call the triple melting pot of American religion. The war also accelerated the decline of anti-Catholic prejudice in American society. Catholic Americans served with distinction in all branches of the military, and Catholic chaplains like Father Francis Duffy became national heroes. The GI Bill allowed Catholic veterans to attend college in unprecedented numbers, leading to the growth of Catholic intellectual life and the emergence of prominent Catholic scholars and public figures. The post-war period saw the beginning of what historians call the Fourth Great Awakening in American religious life. Church membership reached all-time highs, new churches were built at unprecedented rates, and religious themes became prominent in popular culture. Books like Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking and Joshua Liebman's Peace of Mind became bestsellers, demonstrating public hunger for religious guidance in dealing with modern life. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s created new opportunities for religious engagement with social justice issues. African American churches had long served as centers of community organization and resistance to racial oppression, but the civil rights movement brought this tradition into national prominence. Ministers like Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and Fred Shuttlesworth became national leaders, using religious language and imagery to challenge racial segregation and discrimination. King's leadership of the civil rights movement demonstrated the continued power of religious conviction to motivate social reform. His letter from Birmingham jail articulated a theological justification for civil disobedience that drew on both Christian tradition and American democratic ideals. His "I Have a Dream" speech used biblical imagery and language to envision a transformed America where racial justice would prevail. The civil rights movement also revealed deep divisions within American Christianity over racial issues. While many Northern Protestant denominations officially supported civil rights, Southern white churches largely opposed the movement, often using biblical arguments to defend racial segregation. This division created lasting tensions within American Christianity and challenged the moral authority of religious institutions. Catholic participation in the civil rights movement increased significantly during the 1960s, influenced by the Second Vatican Council's emphasis on social justice and human dignity. Catholic clergy and laity participated in civil rights demonstrations, and Catholic institutions like universities and hospitals began racial integration efforts. The growing Catholic commitment to civil rights helped further integrate Catholics into mainstream American society. The 1960s brought new challenges to American religious life, as the decade's social and cultural upheavals called traditional authorities into question. The sexual revolution, the anti-war movement, the counterculture, and the feminist movement all challenged traditional religious teachings about morality, authority, and social order. Many young Americans rejected organized religion as irrelevant to their concerns about social justice, personal fulfillment, and authentic experience. The rise of the death of God theology in the mid-1960s captured the sense of crisis facing American Christianity. Theologians like Thomas Altizer and William Hamilton argued that traditional concepts of God were no longer credible in the modern world and that Christianity needed to be radically reconceived. While few Americans embraced death of God theology literally, it reflected broader questions about the relevance of traditional religious belief in contemporary society. The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, transformed American Catholicism in profound ways. The Council's reforms, including the use of vernacular languages in worship, greater lay participation in church governance, and a more positive attitude toward other religions, helped modernize Catholic practice and thought. American Catholics embraced these changes enthusiastically, leading to what historian Jay Dolan has called the Catholic Revolution of the 1960s. The Council's emphasis on religious freedom and ecumenical dialogue also improved Catholic relations with other religious communities. The long history of Protestant-Catholic conflict in America began to give way to cooperation on social issues and theological dialogue. Catholic participation in the National Council of Churches and other ecumenical organizations demonstrated the changing religious landscape. The emergence of evangelical Protestantism as a distinct movement in the 1940s and 1950s represented another significant development in 20th century American religion. Led by figures like Billy Graham, Carl F. H. Henry, and Harold Ockenger, evangelicals sought to maintain traditional Christian orthodoxy while engaging constructively with modern culture and society. Billy Graham became the most prominent evangelical leader of the century, conducting massive crusades in major cities and advising presidents from both political parties. Graham's success demonstrated that conservative Christianity could appeal to mainstream Americans when presented in sophisticated, culturally relevant ways. His crusades brought together Christians from different denominations and helped create a sense of evangelical unity that transcended traditional denominational boundaries. The founding of Fuller Theological Seminary in 1947 and the emergence of Christianity Today magazine in 1956 provided intellectual leadership for the evangelical movement. These institutions promoted what became known as neo-evangelicalism, a movement that maintained traditional Christian doctrines while embracing academic scholarship and cultural engagement. The turbulent 1960s marked the end of the Protestant establishment's cultural dominance and the beginning of a more pluralistic and contested religious landscape. The consensus that had allowed Protestant leaders to speak with authority on national issues gave way to competing voices representing different religious traditions and secular perspectives. This fragmentation would characterize American religious life for the remainder of the 20th century. By 1970, American Christianity had been fundamentally transformed by the conflicts and changes of the 20th century. The neat categories of the early 1900s, liberal versus conservative, Protestant versus Catholic, had given way to a more complex religious landscape characterized by theological diversity, institutional innovation, and cultural engagement. The stage was set for new religious movements and political alignments that would further transform American religious life in the final decades of the 20th century. The story of 20th century American religion was not just about theological debates or institutional changes, but about the ongoing struggle to define what it meant to be both religious and American in a rapidly changing world. From Harry Emerson Fosdick's challenge to fundamentalism to Martin Luther King Jr.'s religiously inspired civil rights leadership, American religious leaders had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of religious engagement with contemporary culture. The legacy of these struggles would continue to shape American religious life well into the 21st century. The date was November 4th, 1980, and across America, television screens flickered with election results that would reshape the nation's political and religious landscape forever. As the returns poured in, it became clear that Ronald Reagan had not only defeated incumbent President Jimmy Carter, but had done so with the overwhelming support of a voting bloc that many political observers had written off as irrelevant, evangelical Christians. That night, Jerry Falwell, the fundamentalist preacher who had founded the Moral Majority just 1 year earlier, watched the returns with satisfaction. His dream of mobilizing conservative Christians to reclaim America for traditional values was becoming reality. The rise of evangelicalism and its transformation into a powerful political force represents one of the most significant religious developments in late 20th century America. What began as a theological movement seeking to reform fundamentalism evolved into a cultural and political phenomenon that would influence presidential elections, Supreme Court nominations, and national debates on issues from abortion to education to foreign policy. The roots of modern evangelicalism can be traced to the 1940s, when a group of younger fundamentalist leaders began to question their movement's withdrawal from mainstream American culture. These neo-evangelicals, as they came to be known, shared fundamentalism's commitment to biblical authority and traditional Christian doctrine, but rejected its anti-intellectual stance and cultural isolationism. They sought to engage the modern world with the gospel message while maintaining theological orthodoxy. Harold Ockenga, pastor of Park Street Church in Boston, emerged as one of the key intellectual leaders of this movement. In 1947, Ockenga delivered a sermon titled The Unvoiced Multitudes, in which he called for fundamentalists to abandon their separatist mentality and engage constructively with American society and culture. This sermon is often considered the founding moment of the neo-evangelical movement. The institutional foundations of evangelicalism were laid in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Fuller Theological Seminary, founded in 1947 in Pasadena, California, became the intellectual center of the movement, attracting scholars who combined rigorous academic training with evangelical conviction. The National Association of Evangelicals, established in 1942, provided organizational structure for evangelical denominations and parachurch organizations. Youth for Christ, founded in 1944, demonstrated the movement's commitment to reaching young people with contemporary methods and cultural relevance. Billy Graham became the most visible symbol of evangelical renewal. His rise to national prominence began with the 1949 Los Angeles Crusade, which was extended from 3 weeks to 8 due to overwhelming response. Newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst's decision to promote Graham's crusade with the directive Puff Graham helped launch the young evangelist to national fame. Graham's success demonstrated that conservative Christianity could appeal to mainstream Americans when presented with sophistication and cultural awareness. Graham's approach differed significantly from earlier fundamentalist evangelists. He eschewed the harsh, judgmental tone that had characterized much fundamentalist preaching, instead emphasizing God's love and forgiveness. He invited ministers from different denominations to participate in his crusades, demonstrating an ecumenical spirit that fundamentalists had rejected. Most importantly, he engaged with contemporary culture and current events, showing that evangelical Christianity could be relevant to modern life. The founding of Christianity Today magazine in 1956, with Graham's support and Carl F. H. Henry as its first editor, provided evangelicals with an intellectual voice that could compete with liberal Protestant publications. Henry's vision for the magazine was to present evangelical theology and perspectives on contemporary issues in a scholarly and sophisticated manner. Christianity Today quickly became the most influential evangelical publication in America, shaping evangelical thought on theology, culture, and politics. The 1960s presented evangelicals with both challenges and opportunities. The decade's social upheavals, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the sexual revolution, the counterculture, challenged traditional evangelical assumptions about American society and culture. Many younger evangelicals began to question their movement's political conservatism and cultural insularity, leading to what some scholars have called the evangelical left. Progressive evangelicals like Jim Wallis, Tony Campolo, and Ron Sider argued that authentic biblical Christianity required commitment to social justice, peace, and care for the poor. They founded organizations like Sojourners and Evangelicals for Social Action that challenged the evangelical community to apply Christian principles to contemporary social and political issues. The Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern, issued in 1973, committed evangelicals to work for racial justice, economic equality, and other progressive causes. However, the majority of evangelicals moved in a more conservative direction during the 1970s, influenced by concerns about moral decline in American society. The Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade 1973, which legalized abortion nationwide, galvanized evangelical political activism in unprecedented ways. Many evangelicals who had previously avoided political involvement now saw political engagement as a moral imperative. The emergence of the electronic church in the 1970s provided evangelicals with powerful new tools for cultural and political influence. Television evangelists like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and Jim Bakker built media empires that reached millions of viewers weekly. The Christian Broadcasting Network, founded by Robertson in 1961, became a major force in evangelical culture, combining religious programming with news shows that promoted conservative political perspectives. Religious broadcasting transformed evangelical culture in profound ways. It created national evangelical celebrities who could mobilize support for political causes, provided funding mechanisms for political organizations, and created networks of communication that linked evangelical communities across the country. The success of religious television also demonstrated the market appeal of evangelical programming and encouraged the growth of Christian media companies. The election of Jimmy Carter in 1976 initially seemed to represent evangelical political success. Carter, a born-again Southern Baptist who taught Sunday school and spoke openly about his faith, was embraced by many evangelicals as one of their own. His election was seen as validation of evangelical participation in American political life and evidence of the movement's growing cultural influence. However, Carter's presidency ultimately disappointed many conservative evangelicals. His support for the Equal Rights Amendment, his moderate positions on abortion, and his emphasis on human rights in foreign policy conflicted with the increasingly conservative political agenda of evangelical leaders. By 1978, many prominent evangelicals had begun to distance themselves from Carter and look for alternative political champions. The catalyst for evangelical political mobilization was not primarily abortion, as is often assumed, but rather the federal government's challenge to the tax-exempt status of racially discriminatory religious schools. The IRS's decision in the late 1970s to revoke the tax exemptions of Christian schools that practiced racial discrimination enraged evangelical leaders who saw this as government interference with religious freedom. This controversy provided the immediate impetus for the founding of the Moral Majority and other religious right organizations. Jerry Falwell emerged as the most prominent leader of the newly politicized evangelical movement. Falwell had previously adhered to the fundamentalist tradition of political non-involvement, arguing that ministers should focus on preaching the gospel rather than engaging in political activism. However, his growing alarm about moral decline in American society led him to abandon this position and embrace political engagement as a Christian duty. The Moral Majority, founded by Falwell in 1979, with the assistance of conservative political operatives Paul Werrick and Richard Viguerie, represented a new form of religious political organization. Unlike earlier evangelical political efforts, which had focused primarily on specific issues, the Moral Majority articulated a comprehensive conservative political agenda that included opposition to abortion and homosexuality, support for school prayer and traditional family values, and a strong national defense. The organization's name was carefully chosen to convey the message that conservative Christians represented the majority of Americans and that their values were the authentic American values. Falwell and his allies argued that secular humanists had captured American institutions, schools, universities, courts, media, and were imposing their anti-religious agenda on the American people. The Moral Majority positioned itself as representing the silent majority of Americans who wanted to restore traditional moral values to American public life. The religious right's support for Ronald Reagan in 1980 marked a crucial turning point in American politics. Reagan, despite his Hollywood background and relatively secular lifestyle, successfully courted evangelical voters by endorsing their key issues and speaking their language. His victory demonstrated the political potential of the evangelical vote and established a lasting alliance between the Republican Party and conservative Christians. Reagan's presidency provided evangelicals with significant political victories that reinforced their commitment to Republican politics. His appointment of conservatives to the Supreme Court, his support for school prayer amendments, and his rhetoric about traditional values convinced many evangelicals that political engagement could advance their religious and moral agenda. The establishment of the Office of Public Liaison in the White House to maintain contact with religious groups institutionalized evangelical access to political power. The 1988 presidential campaign of Pat Robertson demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of evangelical political power. Robertson, founder of the Christian Broadcasting Network and host of the 700 Club, sought the Republican nomination with strong support from charismatic and Pentecostal Christians. His campaign achieved some early successes, including a second-place finish in the Iowa caucuses, but ultimately failed to build a broad enough coalition to win the nomination. Robertson's campaign was significant not for its electoral success, but for its demonstration of evangelical organizational capacity and political sophistication. The campaign built extensive mailing lists, trained thousands of evangelical activists in political organizing, and established evangelical influence within Republican Party organizations at the state and local levels. Many of the activists recruited by Robertson's campaign would remain involved in Republican politics for decades. The founding of the Christian Coalition in 1989, with Robertson as president and Ralph Reed as executive director, represented the maturation of evangelical political organization. The Christian Coalition eschewed the confrontational rhetoric that had characterized earlier religious right organizations, instead emphasizing pragmatic political goals and sophisticated campaign techniques. Reed's strategy of focusing on local and state politics rather than just national campaigns helped build evangelical influence at the grassroots level. The Christian Coalition's voter guides distributed in churches before elections became a powerful tool for mobilizing evangelical voters. These guides presented candidates' positions on key issues in ways that clearly indicated which candidates evangelicals should support, while maintaining the organization's tax-exempt status by avoiding explicit endorsements. The guides helped create a more informed and engaged evangelical electorate that increasingly voted as a bloc. The 1992 Republican National Convention in Houston demonstrated both the power and the polarizing potential of evangelical political involvement. The convention featured prominent speaking roles for religious right leaders like Pat Robertson and Pat Buchanan, whose speeches emphasized cultural war themes and traditional values. While these speeches energized evangelical supporters, they also alienated moderate voters and contributed to George H.W. Bush's electoral defeat. The Republican takeover of Congress in 1994 was widely attributed to evangelical voter mobilization, particularly around issues like abortion, homosexuality, and traditional family values. The new Republican majority included many evangelical legislators who were committed to advancing the religious right agenda. However, the practical limitations of achieving evangelical goals through the political process soon became apparent as constitutional constraints and political opposition prevented the enactment of many desired policies. The impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998 represented a high watermark of evangelical political influence, but also revealed the contradictions inherent in their political engagement. Evangelical leaders, who had long emphasized the importance of personal character in political leadership, found themselves supporting the impeachment of a president based primarily on personal moral failings rather than policy disagreements. The public's rejection of impeachment suggested that evangelical priorities did not necessarily align with those of the broader American public. By the end of the 20th century, evangelicalism had been transformed from a theological movement seeking to reform fundamentalism into a major political force that influenced elections, policy debates, and cultural discussions. This transformation had profound consequences for both evangelicalism and American politics, creating new opportunities for evangelical influence while also exposing the movement to criticism and internal division. The rise of evangelical political power also raised important questions about the relationship between religious faith and political engagement in American democracy. Critics argued that the religious right threatened the separation of church and state and sought to impose its religious views on the broader society. Supporters countered that evangelicals had the same right as any other group to participate in democratic politics and advocate for their values. The legacy of evangelical political engagement would continue to shape American politics well into the 21st century, influencing presidential elections, Supreme Court nominations, and debates over issues like same-sex marriage, religious freedom, and the role of religion in public life. The story of evangelicalism's rise to political prominence represents one of the most significant developments in modern American religious and political history. In the early morning hours of July 23, 1847, a ragged group of pioneers crested a hill overlooking the Great Salt Lake Valley in what would become Utah. Leading them was Brigham Young, who gazed upon the desolate landscape and declared, "This is the place." Behind Young stretched a wagon train of over 1,000 Mormon pioneers who had fled religious persecution in Illinois and Missouri, seeking a refuge where they could practice their faith freely. Their arrival in the Salt Lake Valley marked not just the founding of a new settlement, but the establishment of what would become one of America's most distinctive religious communities, and a testament to the nation's capacity to nurture new forms of religious expression. The story of Mormonism and other new religious movements in America illustrates a fundamental aspect of the American religious experience: the freedom to innovate, experiment, and create new forms of religious belief and practice. From the burned-over district of upstate New York to the spiritual seeking of contemporary California, America has served as fertile ground for religious creativity and innovation that would have been impossible in more traditional societies. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church, emerged from the religious ferment of early 19th century America. Its founder, Joseph Smith Jr., was born in 1805 in Vermont, but grew up in the Finger Lakes region of New York, an area so marked by religious revivals and enthusiasms that it became known as the Burned-Over District. The region was characterized by intense religious seeking, competing denominations, and a popular culture that welcomed supernatural experiences and divine revelations. Smith's account of his religious experiences reflected this environment, while also transcending it. According to Mormon teaching, Smith experienced a series of divine visitations beginning in 1820, when he was 14 years old. In what Mormons call the first vision, Smith claimed that God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him in a grove of trees near his family's farm, telling him that all existing churches were corrupt and that he should join none of them. The foundational event of Mormonism occurred in 1827, when Smith claimed to have received golden plates from an angel named Moroni. These plates, according to Smith, contained a record of ancient American civilizations and their interactions with God, spanning from approximately 600 BCE to 400 CE. Smith translated these plates, purportedly through divine inspiration and the use of sacred stones, producing the Book of Mormon, which was published in 1830. The Book of Mormon presented a radically different narrative of American history and destiny than anything previously imagined. It claimed that Native Americans were descendants of ancient Israelites who had migrated to the Americas around 600 BCE, and that Jesus Christ had appeared to these ancient Americans after his resurrection. This narrative gave America a sacred history that paralleled and complemented the biblical account, suggesting that the New World had always been part of God's plan for humanity. The early Mormon movement attracted followers through its combination of biblical Christianity with uniquely American elements. Smith's revelations addressed contemporary concerns about democracy, capitalism, and social organization, while claiming divine authority for his teachings. The Mormon concept of continuing revelation suggested that God was still actively communicating with humanity, a doctrine that appealed to Americans who believed their nation represented a new departure in human history. However, Mormon teachings also included elements that put them at odds with mainstream Christianity and American society. Smith's later revelations introduced doctrines about the nature of God, the potential for human deification, and the practice of plural marriage that shocked and scandalized their non-Mormon neighbors. These distinctive teachings, combined with Mormon political and economic cooperation, generated suspicion and hostility that would plague the movement for decades. The persecution of Mormons in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois demonstrated the limits of American religious tolerance when faced with groups that challenged fundamental social and religious assumptions. Mobs attacked Mormon settlements, burned their buildings, and forced them to flee from community to community. The violence reached its climax in 1844 when Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were murdered by a mob while in jail in Carthage, Illinois. The Mormon exodus to the Great Basin under Brigham Young's leadership represented one of the most remarkable migrations in American history. Young, who assumed leadership of the church after Smith's death, organized the movement of approximately 70,000 Mormons to Utah over the course of 2 decades. This migration was motivated not just by the desire to escape persecution, but by the Mormon theological belief that they were God's chosen people, called to establish Zion in the American wilderness. In Utah, the Mormons created a distinctive society that combined religious community with territorial government. Young served simultaneously as church president and territorial governor, creating a theocratic system that governed all aspects of life. The Mormon settlement of the Great Basin demonstrated their ability to transform a harsh environment into productive communities through cooperative labor and religious discipline. The practice of plural marriage, officially acknowledged by the Mormon Church in 1852, created ongoing conflict with the federal government and mainstream American society. While only a minority of Mormon men actually practiced polygamy, the institution became the defining characteristic of Mormonism in the public mind and the primary obstacle to Utah statehood. The federal government passed a series of laws targeting Mormon polygamy, leading to what historian Sarah Barringer Gordon has called the Mormon question in American politics. The resolution of the Mormon conflict came in 1890 when Church President Wilford Woodruff issued the Manifesto, officially ending the practice of plural marriage. This decision, presented as a revelation from God, paved the way for Utah statehood in 1896 and began the process of Mormon accommodation to mainstream American society. The transformation of Mormonism from a persecuted sect to a respected American religion illustrates the dynamic nature of American religious development. The emergence of the Jehovah's Witnesses in the late 19th century represented another distinctive American religious innovation. Founded by Charles Taze Russell in Pennsylvania in the 1870s, the movement, originally known as the Bible Students, developed unique interpretations of biblical prophecy and Christian doctrine that set them apart from mainstream Christianity. Russell's teachings emphasized the imminent second coming of Christ and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. He rejected traditional Christian doctrines about the Trinity, hell, and the immortality of the soul, developing instead a theology that emphasized God's love and the eventual salvation of all humanity. Russell's publications, particularly the Watchtower magazine founded in 1879, spread these teachings to thousands of readers across America and internationally. Under the leadership of Joseph Franklin Rutherford, who assumed control of the movement after Russell's death in 1916, the group became increasingly distinctive and separatist. Rutherford renamed the group Jehovah's Witnesses in 1931 and developed an organizational structure that emphasized evangelism and doctrinal uniformity. The Witnesses' refusal to salute the flag, serve in the military, or participate in civic activities based on their interpretation of biblical commands brought them into frequent conflict with government authorities. The Jehovah's Witnesses' legal battles over religious freedom had significant impact on American constitutional law. Their Supreme Court victories in cases like West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett, 1943, which established the right to refuse to salute the flag, and Cantwell v. Connecticut, 1940, which expanded protections for religious solicitation, helped strengthen the First Amendment's protection of religious minorities. Christian Science, founded by Mary Baker Eddy in the late 19th century, represented yet another uniquely American approach to Christianity. Eddy's book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, published in 1875, presented a theological system that emphasized the power of spiritual understanding to heal physical ailments. Christian Science reflected distinctively American concerns with health, prosperity, and individual spiritual development. The movement attracted thousands of followers, particularly among middle-class urban Americans seeking alternatives to traditional medical care and religious authority. Christian Science practitioners, most of whom were women, offered spiritual healing services that competed with conventional physicians. The establishment of Christian Science churches, reading rooms, and the Christian Science Monitor newspaper demonstrated the movement's institutional success. The 20th century saw the emergence of numerous other new religious movements that reflected America's continuing spiritual creativity. The Unity School of Christianity, founded by Charles and Myrtle Fillmore in Kansas City in 1889, combined Christian theology with metaphysical teachings about the power of positive thinking and spiritual healing. Unity's emphasis on prosperity and success appealed to Americans seeking to reconcile religious faith with material achievement. Scientology, founded by science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard in the 1950s, represented a more controversial form of American religious innovation. Hubbard's system of spiritual technology, which claimed to provide scientific methods for achieving spiritual advancement, attracted thousands of followers while also generating significant opposition from critics who viewed it as fraudulent or harmful. The movement's aggressive legal tactics, secretive practices, and high financial demands created ongoing controversy about its status as a religion. Nevertheless, Scientology's recognition as a tax-exempt religious organization by the Internal Revenue Service in 1993 demonstrated the continued openness of American institutions to new forms of religious expression, even controversial ones. The emergence of the New Age movement in the 1960s and 1970s represented a different form of American spiritual innovation. Rather than creating new institutional religions, New Age spirituality emphasized individual spiritual seeking and the synthesis of diverse religious traditions. New Age practitioners drew from sources as varied as Eastern meditation, Native American shamanism, Western astrology, and contemporary psychology to create personalized spiritual systems. The New Age movement reflected distinctively American values of individualism, pragmatism, and spiritual democracy. It suggested that spiritual truth could not be monopolized by any single religious tradition, and that individuals had the right and responsibility to create their own spiritual paths. This approach appealed to Americans who had been influenced by the counterculture of the 1960s and who sought alternatives to traditional religious authority. Contemporary American spirituality continues to demonstrate the innovative capacity that has characterized American religion since colonial times. The growth of non-denominational Christianity, the popularity of Eastern meditation practices, and the emergence of online spiritual communities all reflect ongoing American spiritual creativity and experimentation. The success of new religious movements in America can be attributed to several factors that distinguish American religious culture from that of other societies. The constitutional guarantee of religious freedom provides legal protection for religious innovation and experimentation. The absence of an established church means that new religious movements compete on equal terms with established denominations rather than facing governmental opposition. American individualism and entrepreneurialism also encourage religious innovation by suggesting that individuals have the right to seek truth for themselves and to organize religious communities according to their own understanding of divine will. The American frontier experience, with its emphasis on self-reliance and community building, provided practical training for religious groups seeking to establish new forms of social organization. The geographic mobility of American society has facilitated the spread of new religious movements by allowing converts to relocate to areas where their beliefs are more accepted. The Mormon migration to Utah, the establishment of intentional communities by various religious groups, and the modern growth of megachurches in suburban areas all demonstrate how geographic mobility has supported religious innovation. Perhaps most importantly, American religious culture has generally maintained what sociologist Peter Berger called a sacred canopy that legitimizes religious seeking and experimentation as authentic expressions of human spirituality. Even when particular new religious movements have faced opposition or persecution, the broader culture has generally maintained the principle that religious innovation is a legitimate expression of American freedom. The story of new religious movements in America illustrates both the opportunities and the challenges of religious freedom in a pluralistic society. These movements have enriched American spiritual life by offering alternatives to mainstream religious traditions and by demonstrating the continued vitality of religious creativity. At the same time, Some new religious movements have raised legitimate concerns about exploitation, fraud, and harm to vulnerable individuals. The ongoing presence of new religious movements in American society testifies to the enduring power of the American religious experiment. From the Mormon pioneers crossing the plains to contemporary spiritual seekers exploring online communities, Americans have continued to exercise their freedom to create new forms of religious expression and community. This ongoing innovation ensures that American religion will continue to evolve and surprise in ways that reflect the nation's foundational commitment to religious liberty and spiritual seeking. September 11th, 2001. A date that would forever alter the American religious landscape. As the Twin Towers fell and the Pentagon burned, the nation's relationship with faith, particularly Islam, was transformed in ways that continue to reverberate today. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, mosques across America became targets of suspicion, vandalism, and sometimes violence. The faith of nearly 7 million American Muslims suddenly found itself under scrutiny in a way no religious community had experienced since Japanese Americans during World War II. Yet the story of post-9/11 America is not simply one of fear and division. It is also a story of resilience, dialogue, and the ongoing struggle to define what religious freedom means in an age of global terrorism and domestic anxiety. Before September 11th, Islam in America was already a complex tapestry. The first Muslims had arrived not as immigrants, but as enslaved Africans, many of whom maintained their faith despite brutal attempts at conversion. By the late 20th century, American Islam encompassed immigrant communities from across the Muslim world. African American converts who had found in Islam a path to dignity and identity, and a growing number of converts from other backgrounds. The Nation of Islam, led first by Elijah Muhammad and later transformed under his son Warith Deen Muhammad, had played a crucial role in the civil rights movement. Malcolm X's pilgrimage to Mecca and subsequent evolution toward mainstream Islam symbolized the faith's growing integration into American religious life. Dr. Amina MacLeod, a scholar of Islamic studies, would later observe that American Muslims before 9/11 were becoming American in the way that other religious communities had, through participation, through service, through the gradual process of cultural integration while maintaining their core beliefs. This process was dramatically interrupted by the terrorist attacks. Suddenly, mosques that had been quietly serving their communities for decades found themselves explaining their faith to suspicious neighbors and hostile media. Muslim Americans discovered that their loyalty to the country was questioned in ways that would have been unthinkable for other religious groups. The federal government's response created additional challenges. The USA Patriot Act expanded surveillance powers, and many Muslim Americans found themselves subjects of investigation simply because of their faith. Immigration policies targeted Muslim-majority countries, and religious profiling became an accepted, if controversial, practice in airports and other public spaces. Yet within this climate of fear, something remarkable began to happen. Interfaith dialogue, which had existed on the margins of American religious life, suddenly became urgent and necessary. Churches, synagogues, and other religious institutions began reaching out to their Muslim neighbors, not just in solidarity, but in recognition that the principles of religious freedom were at stake for all faiths. Rabbi David Saperstein of the Religious Action Center noted, "The test of America's commitment to religious liberty has always come when unpopular faiths need protection." The Muslim experience after 9/11 became everyone's test. The interfaith movement that emerged was unprecedented in its scope and urgency. Organizations like the Interfaith Alliance and the Islamic Society of North America began working with Christian and Jewish groups to combat discrimination and promote understanding. Mosque open houses became common, as Muslim communities invited their neighbors to learn about Islam firsthand. These efforts were not without controversy within religious communities themselves. Some Christian evangelicals saw interfaith dialogue as a compromise of their beliefs, while some Muslim communities worried that too much accommodation might dilute their distinct identity. The tension between maintaining religious authenticity and promoting social harmony became a defining challenge of the era. The media played a complex role in this transformation, While some outlets perpetuated stereotypes and fear, others made genuine efforts to educate Americans about Islam. Television shows began featuring Muslim characters in sympathetic roles, and journalists started distinguishing between the extremist ideologies of terrorist groups and the beliefs of mainstream Muslims. Perhaps most significantly, a new generation of American Muslims came of age in this environment. These young people, many born in America, developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining their faith while navigating increased scrutiny. They founded organizations, created media content, and entered public service in ways that their parents' generation might not have imagined. The election of Keith Ellison to Congress in 2006 and his decision to take his oath of office on Thomas Jefferson's personal copy of the Quran symbolized this new assertiveness. When critics objected to his use of the Quran, supporters pointed out that Jefferson had studied the text as part of his understanding of world religions and natural law. The 2008 presidential election brought these tensions to a head when false rumors spread that Barack Obama was secretly Muslim. The controversy revealed the extent to which Muslim had become, in some circles, a political epithet rather than simply a religious identifier. Obama's repeated affirmations of his Christian faith, while politically necessary, also highlighted the sad reality that being Muslim was seen as politically disqualifying. However, the Obama presidency also marked a turning point in official attitudes toward Islam. The new administration made conscious efforts to engage with Muslim communities, both domestically and internationally. Obama's 2009 speech in Cairo explicitly acknowledged America's Muslim heritage and called for a new beginning in relations between America and the Muslim world. By the 2010s, American Islam had begun to find its footing in the post-9/11 landscape. New institutions emerged that were both authentically Islamic and distinctly American. The Islamic Society of North America continued to grow, while organizations like the Muslim Public Affairs Council became sophisticated advocates for civil rights and political engagement. The construction of mosques became less controversial in many communities, though opposition persisted in others. The proposed Islamic Center near Ground Zero in 2010 sparked a national debate that revealed the ongoing tensions between religious freedom and popular sentiment. While the controversy was painful for many Muslim Americans, it also prompted important conversations about the meaning of religious tolerance. Muslim Americans also began to address internal challenges more openly. Women's roles in Islamic communities became a subject of increased discussion and gradual change. Young Muslims developed new forms of religious expression that honored traditional practices while engaging contemporary culture. The rise of ISIS in the 2010s created new challenges, as the terrorist group's brutal interpretation of Islam prompted fresh waves of suspicion and discrimination. However, by this time, the infrastructure for interfaith dialogue and mutual understanding was more robust than it had been in 2001. Muslim leaders were quicker to condemn extremism, and other religious leaders were more prepared to distinguish between terrorism and mainstream Islam. The Black Lives Matter movement brought additional complexity to the American Muslim experience. Many Muslim Americans, particularly those from immigrant backgrounds, found themselves grappling with issues of race and privilege within their own communities. The legacy of African American Islam, with its roots in the struggle for civil rights, provided important perspectives for these conversations. As the chapter of post-9/11 fear began to close, a new narrative emerged about Islam in America. It was not the simple story of assimilation that characterized earlier immigrant religions, nor was it the tale of permanent outsider status that some had predicted. Instead, it was a uniquely American story of a faith community that had been tested by crisis and had emerged more confident in its place in the American religious landscape. The construction of the Museum of the American Islamic Experience, the growing visibility of Muslim Americans in entertainment and sports, and the election of Muslim Americans to Congress and other offices all signaled a new phase in the community's development. Today, American Islam continues to evolve, shaped by both global events and local experiences. The community remains diverse, encompassing everything from conservative traditionalists to progressive reformers, from recent immigrants to families whose American roots stretch back generations. The interfaith dialogue born from the crisis of 9/11 has become a permanent feature of American religious life, creating new forms of cooperation and understanding across traditional boundaries. While challenges remain, the experience of American Muslims in the post-9/11 era has ultimately strengthened the country's commitment to religious pluralism and demonstrated the resilience of faith communities under pressure. The story of Islam in America after September 11th is ultimately a story about the entire American religious landscape, about how crisis can either strengthen or weaken the bonds of tolerance and understanding, and about the ongoing work required to maintain a society where all faiths can flourish. As America moves deeper into the 21st century, its religious landscape presents a paradox that would have been unimaginable to the Puritan settlers or the founders of the Republic. Never before has the country been more religiously diverse, with faiths from every corner of the globe taking root in American soil. Yet simultaneously, never before have so many Americans identified as having no religion at all. This is the contemporary American religious story, a tale of unprecedented diversity existing alongside growing secularization, of ancient traditions adapting to digital age realities, and of new forms of spirituality emerging to fill the spaces left by declining institutional religion. The numbers tell a striking story. In 1970, fewer than 5% of Americans claimed no religious affiliation. By 2020, that number had risen to nearly 25%, with the trend accelerating among younger generations. Among Americans under 30, the percentage of nones, those who identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, approaches 40%. Yet this apparent decline in traditional religion masks a more complex reality. While membership in established denominations has declined, spiritual seeking has not disappeared. Instead, it has taken new forms that reflect the individualistic, choice-driven character of contemporary American culture. Dr. Linda Woodhead, a leading scholar of religion and society, observes that Americans haven't stopped being religious. They've stopped being religious in the ways their grandparents were religious. This transformation is most visible among millennials and Generation Z, cohorts that have grown up in an era of unprecedented access to information and global connectivity. For these generations, religious authority is not inherited but chosen, and spiritual truth is not received but discovered through personal experience. The digital revolution has fundamentally altered how Americans encounter and practice religion. Meditation apps like Headspace and Calm have introduced millions to contemplative practices divorced from their traditional religious contexts. Online streaming allows believers to worship with communities thousands of miles away, while social media creates new forms of religious community and theological discussion. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples have had to adapt rapidly to these changes. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this digital transformation, forcing even the most traditional congregations to develop online worship capabilities. Many discovered that virtual services could reach people who had never walked through their physical doors. Pastor Craig Groeschel of Life. Church, one of the pioneers of online worship, noted that the internet hasn't replaced the church. It has expanded the church beyond physical boundaries in ways we're still learning to understand. Yet this digital expansion has also created new challenges. The intimate, communal aspects of religious life, the shared meals, the physical presence during times of crisis, the spontaneous conversations that build spiritual community are difficult to replicate in virtual spaces. The growing religious diversity of America is perhaps most visible in its cities. Los Angeles County alone is home to more than 600 Buddhist temples, representing traditions from across Asia. The Minneapolis-St. Paul area has become home to one of America's largest Somali Muslim populations. Hindu temples dot the suburbs of major metropolitan areas, while Sikh gurdwaras serve growing communities across the country. This diversity has created both opportunities and challenges. Interreligious marriages, once rare and often controversial, have become increasingly common. The children of these unions often create new forms of hybrid religious identity that their parents' generation could not have imagined. Sarah, a college student in California, explains her background. "My mom is Jewish, my dad is Hindu, and I was raised going to both synagogue and temple. I don't see this as contradictory. I see it as giving me access to different wisdom traditions that all have something to offer." Such perspectives reflect a broader shift toward what scholars call religious fluidity, the idea that individuals can draw from multiple traditions without necessarily committing exclusively to one. Even within traditional denominations, significant changes are occurring. The Catholic Church in America grapples with declining attendance and the ongoing impact of clerical abuse scandals, while simultaneously serving increasingly diverse immigrant populations that bring new devotional practices and theological perspectives. Protestant denominations face their own challenges and opportunities. Mainline churches continue to decline in membership, but many have embraced progressive positions on social issues that attract some while alienating others. Meanwhile, non-denominational churches have grown rapidly, often emphasizing contemporary worship styles and practical life applications of faith. The megachurch phenomenon, which began in the late 20th century, has continued to evolve. Some have become multi-campus operations with sophisticated media production and social service programs. Others have faced criticism for emphasizing prosperity theology or for the lavish lifestyles of their leaders. Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church in Houston, with weekly attendance exceeding 50,000, represents one model of contemporary American Christianity: upbeat, non-confrontational, and focused on personal empowerment. Critics argue that such approaches dilute the challenging aspects of Christian teaching, while supporters contend that they make faith more accessible to modern Americans. The relationship between religion and politics continues to evolve in complex ways. While the religious right remains influential, particularly within the Republican Party, younger evangelicals are increasingly concerned with issues like climate change, immigration, and social justice that don't fit neatly into traditional political categories. The emergence of leaders like Rev. William Barber II, who has revived the tradition of religiously motivated social activism, demonstrates that faith continues to inspire political engagement across the ideological spectrum. The Poor People's Campaign, which Barber co-chairs, explicitly connects religious values to economic justice in ways that echo the civil rights movement. Meanwhile, progressive religious communities have become more politically active, advocating for immigrant rights, LGBTQ+ equality, and environmental protection. Organizations like Sojourners and the Religious Action Center have worked to present alternative religious voices in political debates often dominated by conservative perspectives. Perhaps the most significant trend in contemporary American religion is the rise of what sociologists call spiritual but not religious identity. These Americans, numbering in the tens of millions, maintain beliefs in transcendent realities and engage in spiritual practices while rejecting organized religion. This category encompasses a wide range of beliefs and practices. Some draw from Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism, practicing meditation or yoga while maintaining Western cultural identities. Others create personalized spiritual practices that combine elements from multiple traditions with contemporary self-help approaches. The popularity of figures like Oprah Winfrey, Eckhart Tolle, and Deepak Chopra reflects this trend toward spirituality that emphasizes personal transformation and universal principles rather than specific doctrinal commitments. Crystal shops, wellness centers, and retreat facilities have proliferated across the country, serving Americans who seek spiritual experience outside traditional religious institutions. The annual Burning Man Festival in Nevada has become a kind of pilgrimage site for those exploring alternative spiritualities and community-building practices. The impact of these changes on families and child rearing is profound. Many American parents find themselves navigating questions about religious education and moral formation without clear institutional guidance. Some create hybrid approaches, exposing their children to multiple traditions while encouraging them to make their own choices about religious commitment. Religious education has had to adapt to these realities. Sunday schools increasingly compete with sports leagues and other activities for children's time and attention. Many have shifted toward more experiential and interactive approaches that reflect contemporary educational philosophy. The rise of religiously unaffiliated Americans has also created new challenges for life cycle events. Weddings, funerals, and coming-of-age ceremonies traditionally handled by religious institutions now often require alternative approaches. Life coaches, humanist celebrants, and other non-traditional officiants have emerged to serve these needs. Looking toward the future, several trends seem likely to continue shaping American religion. Globalization ensures that Americans will continue to encounter diverse religious traditions, whether through immigration, travel, or digital media. Climate change and environmental concerns are becoming increasingly important to religious communities, with many seeing care for creation as a fundamental spiritual obligation. Artificial intelligence and biotechnology raise new theological questions that religious communities are only beginning to address. How do concepts of human dignity and divine purpose apply in an age of genetic engineering and machine intelligence? These questions will likely generate significant religious and ethical debate in coming decades. The COVID-19 pandemic has had lasting effects on American religious life, accelerating trends toward digital engagement while also highlighting the importance of physical community. Many congregations have discovered hybrid models that combine in-person and online elements, potentially creating new forms of religious participation. Despite predictions of religion's demise, faith continues to play a significant role in American life, albeit in forms that earlier generations might not recognize. The country's founding commitment to religious freedom has created space for this continued evolution and experimentation. What emerges from this contemporary religious landscape is not the disappearance of the sacred, but its transformation. Americans continue to seek meaning, purpose, and transcendence, but they increasingly do so on their own terms, drawing from global wisdom traditions and contemporary insights while maintaining distinctly American approaches to individual freedom and democratic participation. The future of religion in America will likely be characterized by even greater diversity, continued technological integration, and ongoing tension between individual spiritual seeking and communal religious practice. What remains constant is the human search for meaning and connection that has driven religious innovation since the first spiritual encounters on this continent. As America moves forward, its religious story continues to be written by millions of individuals, making personal choices about ultimate questions while participating in the larger ongoing experiment in religious freedom that began with the First Amendment. The result is a religious landscape that is uniquely American in its diversity, dynamism, and democratic character, a fitting reflection of the broader American story of continuous reinvention and renewal. The journey of faith across the ocean that began with indigenous peoples thousands of years ago, continued with European colonizers 4 centuries ago, and expanded with immigrants from every corner of the globe, now enters a new phase where the ocean is not just crossed but transcended through digital connection and global consciousness. Yet the fundamental human questions that drive religious seeking remain unchanged, ensuring that this story will continue to evolve for generations to come.